Maverick News, the antivirus program for your mind. And now, the Freedom Reporters.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rick Walker. Welcome back to the Maverick News Channel. I have someone with me tonight. Hello, Lori.
Hello, old friend. Oh, sorry about the old part. Hi.
No foul, no harm. All is well.
It's okay. We're all old folks here.
That's right. I'm becoming accustomed to. I'm secure with it, like my masculinity.
That's right. And my age.
That's right.
It's called aging gracefully, baby.
Well, in my case, maybe not so graceful, but anyway, we have a heck of a show tonight, thanks to you and your efforts to reach out and recruit people for interviews. Do you want to tell people who you've lined up for us tonight?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to say she's old because she's not, but you'd have to be pretty old, I guess, to remember this date in history. Today, June 4th, marks the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who was running for president in 1968. He was challenging a very unpopular incumbent Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who had been the vice president to his brother, President John F. Kennedy. But there was no love lost between RFK and LBJ. By all accounts, those two absolutely hated each other's guts. So when the 1968 election came around, obviously Lyndon was very unpopular with the Vietnam War in full swing, and Bobby Kennedy poised himself as the anti-war candidate. And 2 weeks after he announced his bid for the White House, Lyndon Johnson surprised everyone and pulled out of the race. He just said, I'm not going to run against this Kennedy guy. Kind of makes you wish Joe Biden would think about doing the same thing, but he's too stubborn to do that. At any rate, Kennedy was...
he keeps tripping over his own feet, though, so just give it a little time.
Are you going to play it again?
You never know.
You never know. You've got that video queued up and ready. I just love to watch Biden trip over his own feet. But anyway, so Kennedy was doing pretty well in the primaries. He won the California primary, which was critical to winning the nomination in 1968. And as we all know, on this night, 55 years ago, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, Senator Robert Kennedy gave his victory speech after winning the primary and was assassinated in the back kitchen a few minutes later. And he survived, I believe, for 33 hours on life support after that, before he expired on June 6th. So it seems especially poignant this year, marking 55 years. It seems particularly newsworthy, considering that his namesake, his son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is now following in his father's footsteps and is running for president of the United States. So I thought tonight it would be fitting to remember Senator Kennedy, what he stood for, the dream that was unfortunately aborted by an assassin's bullet, and talk to an author who I think has written the penultimate book on the RFK assassination. Her name is Lisa Pease. She's the author of a book called A Lie Too Big to Fail. And I believe that the National Security Agency or the CIA are messing with her right now, actually. She's texting me like crazy saying, I can't hear you. I can't get in the backstage area. I'm trying to call in and the number's busy. So
yeah, see, I don't know. It's like something weird has happened. She was online with us. She was with us, and now she's not.
Hopefully she can hear my voice.
Bring her up.
Yeah, hopefully she can hear my voice. Lisa, if you can hear us, try to click on that StreamYard link again to enter into the studio. Sometimes it works if you just try again.
Yeah,
Hopefully that will
just
work.
try clicking on the link one or two more times. We'll try and
Mm.
get you in on video. If not, I'll fire up the phone system. The reason it's busy is because the call-in phone system isn't activated yet, Lisa. So this is the mothership to Lisa. Over. Mothership to Lisa. Over. Please click on the link. Please click on the link. Houston, we have a problem.
Yes, we do, Houston. You know what's weird though, Rick? Remember when we had Jim DiEugenio on the show? I think it was about 7 or 8 months ago to talk about his new book and the Oliver Stone film, JFK Revisited. We had similar issues technically with Jim. You remember that? It
I
took
do.
several tries to get him into the studio, and we all thought, somebody messing with us today? So you never know. When you talk about the Kennedys, anything could happen.
Well, while we wait for Lisa to try to reconnect here, I just wanted to maybe tee up everything tonight in this way. I've been playing with the idea of doing regular segments or shows that are sort of branded, if you will, as it's an idea for a whole show similar to what we're doing tonight. And the viewers can maybe weigh in on this at some point during the evening and share your thoughts on this. But I'm thinking we should do a show called True Spiracies.
True spiracies,
True
huh?
Spiracies.
That's
Yes.
interesting.
And so you take a
Tell
subject
me more.
like this. It could be any conspiracy or conspiracy theory. We go out and we find the actual facts or get people as close as we can to the actual truth on any particular subject that would be classified as a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory.
Interesting.
And so we could do maybe once a week a whole show called True Spiracies on the Maverick News Channel. And this would fall
There's a
right
lot of
into
those.
yes, and this would fall right into that category because of course there are many theories about what happened the night of the assassination,
Right?
how things might tie into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and we'll explore all of that tonight. So this could be sort of a trial run of sorts for the first episode of True Spiracies on
That's
Maverick
perfect.
News.
I love that idea, Rick. I do. Well, you know, while we're waiting for Lisa to
Yeah.
try and reconnect, let's talk about that a little bit about what they say, what the official version is of what happened that night, and delve into some of those true spiracies because I'm of the belief, as a historian of the Kennedys, I've been studying this case for more than 40 years. I don't believe the official story. I don't think that Sirhan murdered Senator Kennedy. The evidence points the other way.
Well, you know what? Here's someone who might have all the information we're looking for.
She made it. Yay. Hello, Lisa.
I think I'm here.
You are.
My
We can hear you
gosh.
just fine.
Yeah, literally switched computers.
Well, welcome to the Maverick News Channel. It's great to have you here tonight. A real privilege. I'm excited to hear everything you have to say because I can't say I read the whole book. I didn't start reading it until today. I only got not quite halfway through.
Wow, that's
Speed-
impressive.
speed-
I'm
reading
telling
it.
you.
So I also can't promise that I absorbed all of it, but reading it as quickly as I tried to, but I did get, a fair distance in, and there's some key things in there. Some of the evidence that you cite that really piqued my interest. So I'm very eager to speak with you and get some insight from you.
Well, that's wonderful. Do you want me to start at the beginning? I'm sorry because I missed what Lori said. I just got back on, so I don't want to duplicate for your audience. Did she set up the scene or?
Well, a little bit. No, yeah, she did. She kind of gave the background on what happened, the night of the assassination, that we're now on the 55th anniversary. And Lori is of the belief that Sirhan did not actually kill Robert F. Kennedy. So certainly interested in the evidence that you uncovered because you at some point became interested in this. What was it that sort of led you down this path where you stopped just sort of taking note or taking interest in it and actually actually started to investigate this this
It was
milestone in American history.
It was a very specific moment. I had been researching the JFK case. My very first internet search ever back in 1993, I guess, was JFK assassination. I landed in a discussion group where the topic was hotly debated. I had picked up a book on the Robert Kennedy because to me, whoever killed one probably killed them both. That just made sense to me. But I was just beginning my research. But one day I was at the library. I used to, I'm such a nerd. I mean, I used to go on my lunch hour working downtown, a few blocks down to the library, and look at microfilm and then go back to work. I mean, who does that, right? It seemed very natural to me at the time. But one day I was pulling out a drawer and I literally pulled out the wrong drawer. It wasn't the one I was looking for. And in
that's
it,
where
I
you
saw
found the microfilms.
That's where I found, right, the Robert Kennedy files. And I knew enough to know they had only been released 4 years earlier. They were completely unmarked. I mean, it basically said RFKS, US, LAPD, California State Archives. So I just picked out a film at random and threw it in. And that reel discussed original witness testimony immediately afterwards. And it talked about another guy who had been apprehended and handcuffed at the hotel that night. I'm like, well, wait a minute. We've always been told Sirhan was the only shooter, the only suspect. And so right away that was blown, because if you're going to handcuff somebody, there had to be a reason, right? People must have seen something or thought they saw something. So that kind of sucked me in. And then the more I learned, the more I kind of felt the weight of what I was learning and that I really needed to share it back. So I'll tell you what I learned. And that's, first of all, there was a lot of confusion during the shooting. Sirhan definitely pulled out a gun and fired. For years, I assumed he fired bullets like everybody else assumes. But the further I got into the case, I found, and it was very hard to process this because I think your mind is naturally resistant to it. But I tell you, after 25 years of research and now almost 30, 25 when I wrote the book, Sirhan was firing blanks. And the reason I know this is that not one of the bullets fired in the pantry were ever successfully matched back to his gun. And the police seemed to know this. As I read through the witness interviews, a couple of witnesses started to talk about it sounded like blanks, and usually the police deflected right away. And Rayford Johnson was one of the best witnesses to this because he had seen blank guns fired all his life as a decathlon champion. At every starting line, there's a starter pistol, and he said it looked like a cap gun throwing off residue. He saw a little shower of paper in the air. Now, of course, other people will try and explain that away. Well, Sirhan shot into the ceiling and, the ceiling was, coming down and disintegrating.
From ceiling tiles, yeah.
Yeah, and that could be legitimate if you didn't know what happened. But when I read all the witness statements, believe it or not, they all line up pretty well. And it's not like they all saw wildly different things. And what I did, after a while, because they were all so consistent, I eliminated everybody who didn't see RFK and Sirhan at exactly the same moment during the shooting. And that narrowed it down to about 5 people. And they all, to a person, said they were facing each other, and Sirhan's gun muzzle was about 3 feet from Senator Kennedy's face. So there's no way that Sirhan could have shot Kennedy behind the ear. So that's problem number one. No matter what happened, there were at least 2 shooters because Sirhan couldn't reach around that far.
Because the ballistics evidence also shows that he was shot from behind. And Sirhan,
yes,
all
the autopsy evidence,
all the witnesses said that Sirhan was in front of him.
Was in front, exactly. Now, and again, so the spin on this is, well, Robert Kennedy was spinning and Sirhan was lunging, and there must have been a point where they were nearly in contact, which again makes sense in absentia, but none of the witnesses saw that. In fact, Sirhan was restrained after the second shot, and yet Robert Kennedy was shot 4 times. Sirhan's gun was, gun hand was literally moved away so it wasn't pointing at Kennedy. So how did Kennedy get shot 4 times? I mean, it's just incredible. And I really kind of looked at this very skeptically at first when I talked to Lynn Mangan, a woman who was a neighbor of the Sirhans, and who always thought he was a sweet boy and was so shocked that he could possibly have done something like this. She started looking into it, and she was friends with a criminalist in Pasadena Bill Harper, who was widely respected, unlike the criminalist in LAPD, who was kind of a joke. He was known as the guy who just, dummied up evidence, which is exactly what happened in this case. And she was the first one that told me they switched the bullets, because Harper had told her they switched the gun, they switched the bullets. And I'm like, that's cheating. It's like they wouldn't go that far, right? Well, they did. They did. I went back through the police logs. When a piece of evidence is turned in, everything about it is logged. So when a bullet is turned in, any markings that are on the bullet are logged into evidence at the time it's turned in. And the Thomas Noguchi, who retrieved the bullet from behind Kennedy's ear after he died, marked it TN31, his initials and the last two digits of the autopsy case number, as he always did. Well, the bullet that was in evidence when a panel re-examined this in 1975 on the base in the same spot where it should have said TN31, instead it said DWTN. So we know, and we're talking this, a space the size of a pencil end or a pen end. I mean, it's a very small, 22 caliber is a very small bullet. So it's not like there was room to put DWTN31. It's not there. It's just DWTN. So, and then I looked into the other bullets because there were at least three that the panel in 1975, because there was so many issues with the ballistics, there was a panel convened to re-examine just the ballistics evidence, no other evidence of conspiracy, not the distance issue with Sirhan being too far away or the fact that Sirhan was in front of him when he shot behind. They only looked at the ballistics to see if they could prove or disprove a second gun was used. And of course, they said there was only one gun used. And the press reported only one gun used there. Therefore, Sirhan acted alone. It's like, well, if there was only one gun used, it still wasn't Sirhan. I mean, that's the serious problem. And if you read the report, they really couldn't match the bullets to Sirhan's gun. And I thought that was stunning.
Not only that, the number of bullets is also a problem, right? Because can you explain how the count is off?
Yeah, so the police accounted for, because Sirhan's gun could hold 8 bullets. So they said 7 of them were retrieved from victims. 2 bullets were retrieved from Kennedy, and there were 5 other people who had bullets in them that were retrieved. Again, remember, none of these actually matched Sirhan's gun. So there's an 8th bullet. So they had 3 holes in the ceiling tile in a picture that I think had been made public. So I think they had to account for those 3 holes. So they decided 1 bullet went up into the ceiling, hit something, came back down, and ended up in one of the victims. And then the final 8th bullet just went up and stayed up because an odd number. It must have gone up.
I think I saw that in a Western movie a couple of times.
Yeah. Yeah, my first article about that, I called it the Great Waldo Pepper Bullets, because it's like they're like barnstorming through the pantry. But, what the police didn't tell you is that the FBI had photographs of the door frames behind where Robert Kennedy had entered. All right, he had entered through one set, and then there was like a dividing door, and then there was another door over here. And there was bullet holes in the one that would have been, I'm not sure if it's Kennedy's right or left because I'm confused looking at a mirror image here. Mm-hmm. But in the center divider, there were 2 bullet holes. And in the far south divider post, there were 2 bullet holes. These weren't the same holes. And people misunderstood that, and for years said there were maybe 10 bullets fired, but there were provably 12. And the FBI not only photographed them, they labeled them unequivocally bullet holes. This so upset the county that they wrote the FBI after the 75 panel. This is 1977 when the HSCA is doing their investigation. They're like, psst, hey, FBI, you said those were bullet holes. And if they're bullet holes, we need to be looking for another shooter. And they said, if you had said possible or probable bullet holes, we could ignore it. But since you said bullet holes, you kind of have to give us some guidance here. To my knowledge and to the knowledge of other researchers, the FBI did not ever respond to that. Or if they did, we've never seen their response. So anyway, the FBI knew from the start it was a conspiracy. So why didn't Hoover speak up? Because Hoover was following this case very closely.
That's a really good question, isn't it?
Exactly.
When you consider that Kennedy and Hoover had a very complex relationship themselves and couldn't stand each other.
Right. They would
I
have
don't.
loved to have dumped Hoover at the earliest opportunity.
That's
But
right.
Hoover was being blackmailed by the CIA because Hoover was gay. And early on, when the CIA was literally forming back in 1947, Hoover was one of the biggest opponents
That's
to
right.
having a CIA because he's like, I'm the intelligence agency. I have agents all over the world. We don't need a second agency. I've got this. And he had blackmail material on a lot of people in Congress. And so they really needed a way to neutralize Hoover. So the CIA guys, set up a little operation and literally got photos of Hoover having sex with his lover, Clyde Tolson.
That's
And they
right.
used that to silence him. And that's why he couldn't tell the truth about the JFK case or MLK or RFK or anything.
That's right.
And it's Hoover, for all his flaws, he didn't run assassination teams, at least not at that level. He wasn't overthrowing heads of government. The CIA was.
True. He was just killing black activists like Martin Luther
Exactly.
King and
That's why I
Malcolm
stopped
X and
myself.
Fred Hampton.
Yeah.
But no,
But I
heads of
know-
state was not something that Hoover was into. That was the CIA's job.
Exactly. He didn't do regime change. And
Yeah.
for all the hate he had for the Kennedys, they had up to that point left him where he was, untouched. So, they may have wanted to remove him, but they may have feared him too, and not.
And Lisa, I don't know if you think this as well, but I always felt that there was some mutual blackmail going on there. They say that Hoover, and of course we know Hoover kept a file on President Kennedy. He'd been, wiretapping him and collecting information on his private life, his sexual escapades
Yes.
since 1943 when Kennedy was in the Navy. So Hoover had all
Exactly.
the goods on JFK supposedly, and
Yeah.
they say that Hoover was blackmailing Kennedy, and I posit that Kennedy had knowledge of what Hoover was up to as well. So I think that there was maybe a little mutual understanding between the two, that I won't talk about your private life and you don't talk about my private life, and you've got a job as long as you want it here at the FBI, Mr. Hoover.
That's possible. That's possible. Although, I will say there are so many lies told about JFK's sex life. I'm not saying he never had an affair, but he couldn't possibly have had all the affairs that are alleged. I mean, there aren't that many days on his calendar.
That's one of my pet peeves.
One an
about
hour or
JFK.
something. It's like,
There's so many lies, and people believe them as gospel.
I met a guy who worked in a hotel here in Santa Monica, and John Kennedy had come in with Angie Dickinson, and they were having a nice meal, and he literally fell asleep at the table. It's like, this guy was president. He was working all the time. He was passionate. He was much more passionate about being president than getting laid. I mean, he really wanted to run the country. And so there he is talking to this hot, sexy woman, and he literally falls asleep at the table.
Wow, that's a story I never heard.
Exactly. It's not in print anywhere. I just literally met somebody who worked at the hotel and told me this story. And again, maybe it's totally made up, who knows. But it would fit because
it fits. I tend to believe that, actually.
Yeah, he had a lot of and they had a known relationship, and they were definitely friends at least. So,
well, Angie Dickinson later said, and it's a great quote, sometime after Jack died, some reporter asked her if she ever had an affair with him, and she said yes. She said it was brief. She said it was the most exciting 60 seconds of my life. Before he fell asleep. Presumably he fell asleep quickly. But I love that quote.
Boy. But
we'll never know, and most of those stories are fake anyway. Fake news.
Most of them are honestly made up. In fact, one of them was made up by a CIA agent while I was working on my previous book, The Assassinations. I walked into the grocery store, and there with the tabloids was a woman in the top right that said, I slept with, President Kennedy. I'm like, oh, another one. Then I looked at the name, and it was Priscilla Johnson McMillan.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
She is the woman who met Oswald in 1959 in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and wrote an article about his defection. He never actually defected. And in fact, there's a lot of strong evidence he was a CIA agent on a mission to find out who the mole was, fake defection. to see what the Soviets wanted to know about the U-2 program. If they asked him a lot of questions, they didn't have a mole. If they didn't ask him any questions, then they did have a mole.
I guess
And so,
Priscilla was one of those
yeah.
people that it was kind of like Forrest Gump. She just kind of showed up everywhere, right? She
Oh,
was
yeah.
there with
Well, after the
Oswald in
assassination,
59. She knew Jack Kennedy, and she also
Mhm.
knew
she
Ruth
worked on
Paine.
his Senate staff. She
That's
worked
right.
for him.
Yes.
And honestly, she was not that attractive a woman. I really have trouble believing he ever slept with her. But we do know, because her CI file lists her as a witting asset, because there are also something called an unwitting asset where they're being run and manipulated, but they don't even know they're working for the CIA. But she knew she was working for the CIA.
Exactly.
So it's like when the CIA wants to discredit the Kennedys, they send their assets out. So here's at least one that I think is totally fictional. And then there's an author, David Heyman, who wrote a bunch of books on the Kennedy. And I have a friend who has taken them apart line by line and showed how every one of his episodes is wholly fictional.
Yep.
You know, he'll be like quoting a cop. That cop never existed. She literally called every county in that state looking for that cop. And I mean, she's like dogged. It puts most of the JFK researchers to shame.
Of all
So,
the
like I
books
said, it's
out
not
there,
that he
people.
never had affairs, but most of the ones that were made public were not the ones that happened.
You know, I have to ask because C. David Heyman started this rumor, and it was a rumor that was going around for a long time. Since you're an expert on RFK, I figured I'd just ask while we're shooting down conspiracy theories.
If it came from him, it's a lie. I can tell you that
probably
without even
is.
knowing. But go
You know,
ahead.
he alleges in one of his books that after Jack's assassination, that Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy got involved
Had an affair.
romantically. Yeah.
No.
Do you think
No.
there's any evidence to
No.
support that?
No, they were very close and friendly, and he cared about her and she cared about him, and they were both grieving the death of Jack, and he was concerned for Jack's kids. So they did spend time together.
Yeah.
I've never seen any credible evidence, and I read that stuff. When I see it, I read it because I'm like, well, maybe there's a fact in there somewhere. It's always fact free, and it's, you know, when you follow who they source it to, and then those people either don't exist or conveniently died 12 years before he ever made that allegation. See, David Heyman is famous for that. He'll put words in the mouth of Kenny O'Donnell and claim it's from an interview. But Kenny O'Donnell died in the 70s, and
Right,
he's written like 3 or 4
1977.
books before that where he never surfaced that. It's like I would have led with that. You know, it's yeah. So
Right.
take those rumors with an enormous grain of salt.
There is so
Anyway,
much
let's get back to the Robert
disinformation out
Kennedy
there.
case.
You know, there's
There
so
is.
much
And it's-
disinformation about the
If the
Kennedys.
CIA killed the Kennedys, it's
Right.
very much in their interest to paint them as guys you don't like and don't
Right.
care about, because then you'll never look into the details of their deaths because you
Correct.
really don't care about them. And honestly, I was in that camp in the sense that I was young. You know, I was too young to understand what's happening. Bobby was the one I remembered because I remembered seeing the funeral train and all those people saying goodbye. And even as a little kid, I literally had the thought, oh my God, the best politician of my life is dead and I'm still just a kid. I mean, it was so disheartening to me. I just, you know, and for years I couldn't talk about him without breaking into tears. In a way, writing this book was cathartic because now I can talk about it and not cry. But, you know, JFK was just like this weird image to me because although I was born while he was alive, I was so young, you know, that it didn't mean anything to me until I started getting into these cases and found out how much we hadn't been told. So,
And
but
just to make people, we really haven't plugged your book here yet, and this is one of the main reasons you're on the show tonight. Is you are the author of A Lie Too Big to Fail, and this explores evidence that really has not previously been released to the public that you uncovered when you started going through those microfilms. And for people who are maybe too young to understand what I'm talking about when I say microfilms, this was, of course, in the 1960s, before computers. So back in the day, they had long film strips, and they would put images, pictures of documents, newspaper articles, any kind of written documentation, pictures, and so on, and then you would put it on a viewing machine and scroll back and forth. And yes, I am that old.
I'm that
I have
old
used
too.
them, yes.
I remember those things.
That's right. Yeah, it was kind of a pain getting that stuff threaded so that you could actually read through the documents.
Well,
But
Lisa,
And
tell me a little bit about the documents that you unearthed in your research that had been kept from the public and why they were kept from the public.
right. So again, it was the LAPD did their own investigation. They called it Special Unit Senator. They had a special unit set up. Some of them had been, one of them, one of the leaders had been retired officially months before the assassination, but they brought him back. And the guy that they brought back was Manny Pena, who had worked with the CIA. His brother said he was very proud of his service to the CIA. It's like it was kind of an open secret. And he was put in charge of the conspiracy investigation because they had, different things like the medical evidence and this and that. But he was the one who had full say. And so it was very interesting to read witness interviews because Pena would put his comments on a cover sheet of each interview. And for example, there was a girl in a polka dot dress who had been seen not just by Sandy Serrano. She had been seen by more.
Numerous witnesses.
I have like 20 witnesses to a girl in a polka dot dress.
She was even
that
photographed
night.
her pictures in the newspaper.
No,
Wasn't it?
that was a staged photo. And I
Hmm.
wouldn't have known that if I hadn't met the guy who worked for that newspaper, Citizen News. Yes, there's a picture in the upper left or right. Again, I can't do it in mirror image of a girl from the back in a polka dot dress. That was staged. That is not the real girl. But she was picked because she sounded like she fit the description. A little bit chunky, very curvy, big bouffant black hair, a white dress with dark polka dots, because a couple of witnesses talked about a black dress with white polka dots, which is not the same thing. And there were at least 2 different girls seen with somebody who looked like Sirhan that night. And in the course of my research, it became very clear that there were 2 teams. Sirhan was with the girl who was voluptuous, and then there was a very skinny girl with a very straight nose and kind of flat chested in a polka dot dress that was with a Sirhan lookalike. And I believe that they had one team upstairs and one team downstairs, because when Kennedy exited, he could have gone either way. And they really wanted to get him before he got in his car. It's very clear that they might have even had a couple of assassination attempts 2 episodes prior. There was somebody who looked very much like Sirhan, who seemed to have a gun in his pocket at an event in Oregon. Sirhan was not in Oregon. But, the way things can be twisted, I'm sure they could have, flown him up there and had him on standby to be arrested if the other guy got caught. It's so weird. And then there was an event out in Pomona where a girl in a polka dot dress and a guy.
You had me going there
guy
for
who
a
looked
minute.
like Sirhan. Yeah, Sirhan in a polka dot dress and a guy. Yeah, there you go. But it's like they had kind of broken into an event that Kennedy was having, a private event out in Pomona. So there was also a sighting of a girl in a polka dot dress and Sirhan lookalike, or Sirhan, on the Sunday, 2 days before the actual shooting. And again, maybe that was a dry run. Maybe that was an attempt that didn't come off. Maybe they didn't get a good moment with him, and that was the end. I know in the JFK case, there were 3 previous plots that had failed before they finally got him in Dallas. Because people are like, oh, you can't keep things secret that long. It's like, look how long.
Oh, yes, they did.
Yeah, it's like, just don't report it. These plots were kept secret for years.
Those were known only to the Secret Service, pretty much.
Yes, exactly. And eventually some researchers pried it free. And I believe I've pried free a lot of what really happened there. And the most interesting character in the pantry is the guard who was holding Kennedy's elbow and leading him through the pantry, gets about halfway through. And then one witness said it looked like the guard was holding him in place while he was being shot. And I believe that was Thane Eugene Caesar's role.
Right.
See, Kennedy was shot 3 times under the arm, right by where the guy was holding him. All right. He was literally holding this elbow, and Kennedy was shot under that. So I could be holding the elbow with one hand and shooting under. And Thane Caesar's a big, bulky guy. He was like 6 feet, and with his own body could have hidden his hand, shot him under the arm where no one could see. And that's The one that was retrieved was one of the ones that was shot from under the arm and lodged in the back of his neck. All right, but if Caesar had actually held his gun up to Kennedy's head, many more people would have seen it. And in fact, there were 2 witnesses who said it was a guy in a white busboy uniform who shot Kennedy right at his head, like literally with a gun against his head.
And of
Only
course,
2
witnesses can
witnesses.
often be confused. We know who the busboy was, and of course, he was innocent. He was trying to
Oh,
render
no, no, no.
aid.
No. I'm talking about a busboy that has never been interviewed or captured or
Oh,
seen. And in fact, I talked to Juan Romero because I'm like,
right.
you knew all the other busboys. Was there anybody there, that you don't remember hearing interviewed or that disappeared that day? And he goes, there was this one guy, Walter. And so it's like there could have been other, and of course, it wouldn't even necessarily have been an actual busboy. It could have been anybody dressed in a busboy uniform. And so I literally met one witness on the set of Bobby. I was in Emilio Estevez's film
Oh,
Bobby.
yes. Yeah.
I had actually shared some of the Girl in the Polka Dot Dress files with his assistant, who later became his wife. And it was fun because I'd arranged them in like order of like light information to heavy information, and her jaw literally kept hanging further as she got through the file, to the point where it was like her jaw was like on the table as she's reading it. It was so funny to watch. And she's like, oh my God, there was a girl. Because I thought maybe they could work that into the film, but they chose not to. But the other guy, I mean, the person that I met had actually been in the pantry. And his name is Ray. And if I do an update on my book, I'm going to write about him because he's written about it a couple of times. He was 100% certain that he saw Sirhan shoot Robert Kennedy from behind. And I'm like, well, it couldn't have been Sirhan. And
It's
he's like, and
impossible.
he was in a white busboy uniform. They were using lookalikes. And that's so that if anybody saw somebody and they remotely resembled Sirhan, it would be easy to explain it away.
That makes
But
a
he
lot
was-
of sense because in the
does.
JFK assassination, there are multiple Oswalds who look just enough like Lee Oswald that witnesses would
Exactly.
say, oh, I saw that Oswald guy at the car dealership or here or there.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
way it doesn't matter who sees what, because they're going to say, oh, he had dark curly hair and he looked ethnic good. It must be
Close
Sirhan.
enough. And
And
Los
that's what the
Angeles is full of
LAPD
guys
did.
like that. There's a lot of
Exactly.
Mexicans, Hispanics out there. And at first, a lot of witnesses described Sirhan as Hispanic,
Yeah, and some thought he was Filipino, which is interesting
Yeah.
because the CIA had a Filipino assassin who had also been hypnotically programmed, but he'd been deported under a fake name to the Philippines, which I learned is a way they infiltrate people into a country. They send them back, and get them into jail and then hope they can break out and complete their task. But in jail, the guy was behaving so weird that the head of the NBI, his brother, was a hypnotist. And I talked to this hypnotist too. And, he found that under his watch, there was like this special code. And if he read the code out in different combinations, it would exhibit different behaviors. And if the guy was faking,
Wow.
and he would read words like sand, flowers, I mean, very common words that he found would trigger certain
That would be the
behaviors.
trigger.
Right.
You
And
know,
if they
before we
showed him
get
a
into
picture of
mind control,
Marcos-
because that's going to be another aspect of this story and very important aspect, I do want to interrupt real quick just to point out to some of the younger members of our listening audience. You may be sitting here listening and going, wait, how did all these unauthorized people dressed as kitchen workers and how did they all get backstage into this little kitchen area? It's important to point out that back then, presidential candidates did not receive Secret Service protection.
Right.
Security for the Kennedy campaign in 1968 was essentially run by a couple of guys, a couple of friends of Robert Kennedy, who
And Thane Caesar was a security guard hired by the hotel to be there.
And he had just gotten that job, right? Like a couple of days earlier, he'd just been hired by this security company. So he was a rent-a-cop. And he was authorized to have a firearm.
When they asked for his phone number, he couldn't even give the phone number of his employer. He gave the phone number of his friend who got him the job. So it's like that should, there's so many loose threads, where people could follow up. And had the police wanted to do a real investigation, they could have. There was so much data there.
I should
But
point out, just to finish my point real quick,
Mhm.
the administration of Lyndon Johnson, before he left office, immediately after the assassination of RFK, he immediately introduced a bill
Right.
to have Secret Service protection for presidential candidates, and that's been the case ever since. But
Right.
unfortunately, that was not the case in 1968. Just to
It was
clarify that.
not. It was not. And also, something that might be familiar to what people hear today, every time there's a mass shooting, we hear for like, you need to give up your guns and we need gun control. And of course, that was said after Robert Kennedy was shot, too. It's like,
We
you
got
got to
the
get
Gun
guns
Control
off.
Act of 1968 because of that assassination. Yeah, that and
Yeah.
Dr. King,
Yeah.
because those two events happened just 2 months apart, like to the day. Dr. King
Yeah.
was shot on April 4th, and then Bobby on June the 4th. So,
And it's funny that you mentioned the dates because I read an article from E. Howard Hunt where he said something about dates are chosen for psychological impact. Martin Luther King was killed exactly a year to the day after his first speech against the Vietnam War. Bobby was killed supposedly by a Palestinian a year to the day after the start of the Six-Day
Six-Day War.
Arab-Israeli War. So, that makes it look even more like a protest by Sirhan against the Palestinians, which of course was official story. It's like he was a Palestinian. He was upset with Robert Kennedy because Kennedy had suggested sending bombers to Israel.
correct.
And it's,
Or
yeah,
rather
we have
incorrect,
to
but
get into the mind control.
that was the
aspect for
official
people to
story. But I
understand.
know you have a problem with that story, and
Yeah,
so
of
do I.
course. Of course. And the
Let's
thing is,
dive
I mean,
into that a little.
Sirhan was a proud Palestinian. He was very upset. They had been middle class in the Middle East and had a nice home with a lawn, and the father had a job,
And
and
they were
then the
Christians, which
war
is
came
important to
down.
point out. He was a Christian.
Yeah, well, and a lot of the Arab Palestinians were Christians.
Right.
He was not unusual. I mean, I wouldn't say a majority, but it's close to like 50%. A lot of them were Christian. Yeah, he was no Muslim terrorist, as Mel Eitan said in his ridiculous book. Don't even bother to read that one. But what I wanted to say is that his family had been middle class, and then the War of Independence, as the Israelis call it, or the Nakba, as Palestinians call it, the time of great horror and darkness. That's basically why Sirhan came to America. His family, they lost their home. They were bombed out. They had to go live in a shelter with 40 other families that shared a single pit for a toilet, if you can imagine. They didn't have beds, so they took whatever clothes they had and stuffed them in sacks and slept on that. Their food was like flour and water dropped off by the United Nations. I mean, it was horrific. Sirhan went to pull water from a well one time, and it came up with a severed hand in it. Another time, he saw a brother of his killed. That brother was named Munir. He was so upset and distraught by that when his next brother was born, the youngest brother, the mother named him Munir to calm Sirhan because he was so upset about losing the older Munir. So the Munir Sirhan, who's still living today, the last living member of this family outside of Sirhan in jail, is actually the second Munir in that family. So
That's
it's just
Sirhan's younger brother. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he had an older brother, Munir, who was killed, and now he has a younger brother, Munir, who's still alive and partially blind and could really use Sirhan's help, which is one of the reasons I want Sirhan freed. He didn't do it. He provably didn't do it. The ballistics clear him. The eyewitnesses clear him. And like I said, why would he stand there firing blanks and taking the blame for conspiracy if it was conspiracy? The only logical explanation for that is the one that he's always claimed. He said, I have no memory of this. When you're hypnotized, and people who've not been to hypnosis shows or not themselves been hypnotized, well, actually, people who have themselves been hypnotized usually don't understand this because a lot of them think they weren't hypnotized. And I would see this as I was studying the hypnosis angle, because to me, it's very obvious Sirhan was a hypnotized patsy put in place to fire a gun of blanks, pull all the focus in the room so that at least 3 other gunmen could get the job done. One being Caesar, one being the busboy who shot him in the head. And there was also a shooter on the table. And there's videos still online of George Green being interviewed moments after he's like, the shooter stood on the table.
Oh, yes.
It's
That's
like,
right.
it's
Because there were a
right
lot of
there. And he's not
cameramen
the
who
only
were
one.
standing on tables to try and get a
Yes.
better angle for
Right.
their cameras. So was this person
And
posing
they
as a
had guns
journalist?
in
or-
cameras too, which is something people don't
Yes.
understand. And I learned about when Gerald Ford went by my house in 1975. It was the
Mm.
day before Sarah Jane Moore shot him, and she had
Yeah.
already threatened to get him at Stanford. And I lived in Palo Alto, and Ford went right down Embarcadero Street. I'm a little kid, I'm like 13, and I went to the front door and I lifted my camera, and a SWAT team member jumps off, points the gun at me, and says, "Put the camera down."
Oh,
And I was
my.
terrified. I'm like, why can't I take a picture of the president? They literally had rifles in cameras. And
Mhm.
so they couldn't take a chance that I wasn't going to kill, President Ford. They'd already had a threat that day. I didn't learn that until years later. But one of the
Mm.
witnesses said when the bullets started, she said it sounded like flash bulbs going, like breaking. And I thought if somebody had a camera gun, that's probably what it would sound like, because maybe the bullet came out through the flash bulb. It's
With the
a wild.
CIA, anything is possible. It
Well,
is
I've been to the
certainly
CIA
possible.
museum. They have a gun that's a 22 that looks exactly like a pack of cigarettes, but hit a certain button, boom, it fires. They had another gun you wear like a ring, and the bullet is under your hand, and when you move your finger, the bullet comes firing out. The
Incredible.
Navy had because somebody talked about how the guy with the busboy with his hand at Kitty's head, one of the witnesses like, but I didn't see a gun. I don't know why I didn't see a gun. Well, they had these guns that were hidden inside white gloves. And if it was like a plunger action. If you put enough pressure, it would trigger the gun and fire into the person's head. And this is all, again, I'm not making any of this stuff. This is all right out of the LAPD's files and out of the witnesses that I interviewed. And I will say I always weighted the earliest statements first, because people are easily turned around by what the LAPD said. And a lot of them did change their story because the LAPD said, well, you couldn't have seen that.
Oh,
And
my
some people
goodness.
gave
I
in
mean,
right away.
there's a
Now, others,
recording, you know the one I'm talking about, of a
yes,
witness
Sandy
named Sandy
Serrano.
Serrano, who was
Yes,
being
I
interrogated
devoted
by
a
the
whole
LAPD.
chapter to that
Yes,
because her interview was absolute psychological warfare.
it
It was
was.
criminal what they did to her. And
Yes.
in fact, when I interviewed Paul Sharaga, one of the first to be on the scene after the shooting, and he had called in a totally different suspect, a tall blonde guy, with sandy hair, 6'2", that witnesses told him was the shooter. So it's like there were numerous people with guns. There were people who saw people running through the lobby with guns and vaulting over a sofa and running out. And, another person saw what appeared to be a handoff of a gun from one person to another. There were so many people with guns there. Again, to me, it's just so clear he wasn't going to get out of that Ambassador Hotel alive. And there is an interesting story, which I don't think Rick's gotten to yet, because it really stood out to me. A woman at the downstairs area, because if you had gone out the back of the stage as Kennedy did, if you go right, you go through the pantry. But if you go left, you go downstairs to where the public victory party was. And in the hall, right outside that room, there was a bar set up, and an interesting incident with a polka dot dressed girl there. But there were like 3 guys sitting in the dark there, all with dark curly hair, all that looked like they didn't belong there. It's like the backup assassins or something. I mean, it's just, it's so weird. You just, people, how do I say, people who skim my book are doing a real disservice, because there's so many
There is so much
interesting
info
nuggets
in there.
in there. Yeah. And
So in his journal, he wrote over and over again, RFK must die.
if he wrote
So-
it. If he wrote it, because one of the first people from the LAPD to look at that couldn't say that was Sirhan's writing. Sirhan himself had no memory of writing anything like that. And of course, his lawyers are like, well, if he didn't write it, it was a conspiracy, and we don't want to argue he was part of a conspiracy because that would make him look even more guilty. But if he was being mind controlled and programmed, he may have written it, he may not have. The reason I'm not at all convinced is I have seen writing that he did for his lawyers because they hypnotized him after, when they were constructing his defense, they were trying to get him to remember, since he clearly had a black hole for the whole pantry scene. And that's why Sirhan hadn't proclaimed his innocence for years, because he assumed he was guilty because everybody told him he had done it. And he had no memory to prove otherwise. So he had to accept this terrible fate. But when he wrote for his lawyers, the writing is very different than what I see in the notebook. So I'm not even convinced that Sirhan wrote that. I wouldn't put it past the CIA to dummy up a diary, to make it look like he'd been planning this all along.
So in 1989, David Frost did that interview where they say that he admitted his guilt, but when I watch it, it doesn't really sound like a full admission to me. What do you make of that interview that happened?
Well, I talked to Munir about that. I talked to Munir. He's like, Lisa, that was entirely scripted for him. And he was told if he said exactly that, he could get paroled. And then, of course, he did say exactly what they asked him to, and they didn't parole him anyway. So, talk about bait and switch.
Lisa, do you think that they took advantage of the fact that he was a newly minted immigrant who didn't speak English very well, who really did not understand the law in the United States? And I mean, he would have been so easily manipulated due to cultural differences and the language barrier.
I think it was mostly the case that he was super hypnotizable. And he was so hypnotizable that people at a bar found this out and played jokes with him. He was in there, again, this is in the LAPD's own files. There was a guy, not Pasadena, but one of those Arcadia or, one of those little cities around there. And Sirhan was in there, and they just put him under and started playing tricks with him because they could. And Sirhan had a terrible fall. He wanted to be a jockey, and he was working at a racetrack and had a serious injury. They were racing in the fog, and one of his horses threw him, supposedly. And
he ended up in a hospital.
And it turned, according to the doctor, his injuries were very minimal, thank God. As he had some heavy bruising and a little internal bruising, and but nothing that was long term. So I don't know if you've ever been in a hospital. I've been in a hospital. I've had surgery. I never went back to a doctor 13 times in the next 12 months after any of my incidents or surgeries. And his was supposed to be very mild. But the FBI found that he went to a doctor 13 times. Interestingly, they didn't reveal which doctor. So I thought that was very interesting too. And I think somebody in the hospital probably noticed how suggestible he was. In one of my books on hypnosis, that was one of the places they spot people is in hospitals, because people coming out of anesthesia and stuff, it's really easy to tell like who's hypnotizable and who isn't. And so they said that was a perfect place to get hypnosis victims.
I've often wondered if his special doctor was named Dr. Jolyn West.
Well, I don't think. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think it was Jolly, but it could have been because he was operative in LA at that time. Right. The reason I don't think he was is I really think it was William Bryan who was the hypnotist. And William Bryan is very much like Jolie. In fact, they worked together on a couple of cases. Together. Yes.
And MK guys.
And the thing about William Bryan is he used to brag all the time about having been the guy who hypnotized a confession out of the Boston Strangler. And in later years, research showed that guy didn't do it. He didn't do any of it. He just had this really great memory. He liked to please people. And somebody kind of programmed him to take credit for all these crimes. Susan Kelly, it's an excellent book. It's called The Boston Stranglers. I recommend people go read it. But William Bryan was involved in that case, doing very coercive hypnotists, and literally planting the motive during hypnosis. And they tried to do that with Sirhan, and it didn't take, interestingly enough. Sirhan, there's Kennedy. Do you see him? Look at him. Reach for your gun, Sirhan. Where's your gun? All right, fire at him. Fire, fire, fire. Do you remember that?
Right.
But as
And I
soon as
just
he
want to
came out of
mention
hypnosis, he still
also
couldn't
that
remember.
during the years of his incarceration, Sirhan has been seen by a number of different psychologists and experts on hypnosis, particularly and perhaps notably Dr. Daniel
Dan Brown.
Brown.
I write
Um,
about that in my book, and I
He's
quote
the
from the
leading
transcripts.
expert on hypnosis and coercive persuasion at Harvard Medical School. And he spent at least a decade working one on one with Sirhan while he was behind bars, trying to deprogram Sirhan. He
Well, not
found,
so much deprogram, but he interviewed him in a very different way. Whereas everybody else had been coercive, reach for your gun and can you remember that? And he's like, what did you see? What happened? What happened next? And through that scenario, Dan Brown got Sirhan to remember he was enticed by this woman in a polka dot dress who seemed very sexy to him. Sirhan thought he might get lucky and he was following her around like a puppy. She led him into the pantry. She got him up on a tray stand and was holding him, which was what Vince DiPiero saw. Sirhan said at that point, she looked up to the right. That would have been, from that position, exactly where the shooter on the table would have been standing. And that must have been the person signaling her that, hey, Robert Kennedy's coming in. And so then she moves Sirhan directly to the middle of the room. And then she pinches him in a certain way. And Sirhan, in his hypnosis memory, he said, suddenly I was back at the shooting range. He'd spent 8 hours that day at a shooting range doing target practice, just because he thought it was fun. It's like, again, he was not going to the target range to practice to kill Kennedy. And in the pantry, Sirhan was seeing a target. He was not seeing Kennedy. And I would not have believed that or understood that had I not seen a very specific episode at one of these hypnosis shows that I went to. I had gone to a show and I actually ended up talking for like 20 minutes before a show to a woman who ended up being one of the participants. So I thought, great, I'll get a before and after. She was as normal, as nice as any normal person could be, right? Gets up on stage during the show. He's like, you won $1 million or $35,000. And he's like, this is a check for $35,000. And he hands her what's clearly like a Monopoly $100 bill or something. And she jumps around, as you would expect, and so on. So anyway, the show ends. You're all unhypnotized. Go home. I talked to the hypnosis person. I wanted to ask him about the Sirhan case. He got very uncomfortable and left the area quickly. Too young to have been involved, but clearly a sensitive subject. And as the crowds are partying, that woman is still there. And so I went up to talk to her, and she looked kind of distressed. And I thought maybe she'd lost her family or kid had wandered off. I wanted to see if I could help. And she's like, well, I have to give this back. And I'm like, it's just play money. I don't think he cares. And she goes, no, it's a $35,000 check. And it's just play money. And so I said, can I hold it with you? Let's look at it a little closer. What do you see in the upper right-hand corner? I'm pointing to like the 100 in a circle. And I said, do you see that this is just a play? And she's like, no, it's a $35,000 check. And that was the first time I realized you can make people see things that aren't there. And at that point, I hadn't read Dan Brown yet, but I thought Sirhan was seeing something that wasn't there. And that's what he was firing at. And so it's clear to me that he was programmed to fire at a target on command. And he assumed there was a target. Mentally, that's what he was firing at. He was not even firing at Robert Kennedy under hypnosis.
and
That's what
Dr.
Dan Brown
Brown,
elicited.
Dr.
Yes.
Brown did something remarkable with Sirhan. He was able to find one of the triggers that was programmed into his mind and was able to trigger Sirhan into going into his firing position.
Right. They called
just
it
as he
range
was-
mode.
Range mode, yeah.
Yes. And I asked Munir about that. I said, well, I sure hope the hypnotist took that out of him, because if he's ever freed, I
Right.
wouldn't want somebody coming and re-triggering that. And he says, yes, he fully removed that suggestion.
I'm glad you
So-
said that, Lisa, because I
Yes.
know you've been advocating for Sirhan's release, and
Yeah.
many people are. But my question that I've had about that, once I saw interviews that Dr. Brown had done about his work with Sirhan, when I heard about how he was able to trigger him with just a very simple word, I forget what the word was, or a
Yeah.
pinch or something, that he
Yeah,
was
it
in
was the
range
pinch.
mode.
It was the pinch that the
The
girl gave
pinch.
him. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Simple pinch. And I
And
thought,
that's it.
my
He went
God,
into
what if
range
this
mode
guy
and
is
started firing.
released and somebody triggers him again?
Pinches
I
him
mean,
at the store. Yeah, is he going to turn around and shoot at them? Yeah.
right.
But no. I made sure, and he said yes. Dan Brown cleared that from his mind. So I hope that's true. Yes.
I hope so too.
Yes.
Because
And
I
it's
really feel
very
that he should be free. I agree with you. I've looked at the evidence. I truly believe that although Sirhan's gun, the bullets did hit other innocent bystanders.
No, they
in the
didn't. See,
room.
this is where Paul Schrade always had it wrong. And
Oh,
Paul
okay.
Schrade was, how do I say it? He was always about 2 years behind me in the evidence. So I wish he hadn't died, because I know he would have
I
come to the
know.
same conclusion. Because I remember speaking at a conference saying the bullets were switched, and he vigorously argued with me and put me down in front of everybody. 2 years later, he saw the evidence and he was saying the same thing I was.
Oh,
And but
I
what
see.
he always assumed Sirhan had shot him.
Yeah.
And yet,
So he
no
told
part
me.
of the bullet from Paul's head was ever matched to Sirhan's gun. And after I finished my book, I realized I found a file from the DA's office where they knew this. And he said, isn't it curious that not one of Sirhan's lawyers have ever noticed or picked up on the fact that none of the bullets ever matched Sirhan's gun, and argued that he could be a potentially innocent man. And it's and the reason for that is that I believe strongly certainly Grant Cooper, his first lead attorney, was literally compromised by the CIA. He'd been caught cheating in a different case that involved Johnny Roselli, one of the mobsters that Robert Mayhew had hired to try to kill Castro.
That's a fact.
And exactly. And so Grant Cooper had either been set up or not. It's funny because he's like, I didn't get the file from any other source but the government. In other words, it sounded like the CIA slipped him the file, and he used it, not realizing or not caring that he was being set up, assuming he would be protected. They held his penalty, which could have been complete disbarment. It could have been jail time, could have been a huge fine, and at the lower end, it could be a couple $1,000s, basically. And so they held that punishment over his head until the Sirhan case was completed. And then when Sirhan got the death penalty, Grant Cooper got the lowest possible punishment. Now, if they already
See how that works?
Yeah, exactly. It's like that, and the FBI in their own documents, they referred to Cooper's dilemma, like save himself or save Sirhan.
Right.
And reading the trial transcript, Cooper was like a prosecutor. He was not acting like a defense attorney. It was so horribly shocking to me. At one point, the police even came to him and said, we can't prove the bullets came from the people we're going to say they come from. Because normally, when you go into court, they have to establish a chain of possession. They have the doctor testify. Yes, I pulled the bullet out of this person, I put an X on the base. And then they go to the cop and he's like, yes, I took the bullet with an X, and then he had it, and they have to establish that in the court. And the police are like, can't really prove that. And Cooper's like, that's okay, I'll stipulate to whatever you want to say. It's like, he's basically just conceding guilt, even though they've given him evidence that could indicate his client might even be innocent. And Robert Blair Kaiser, who'd been working on the case too, had written Cooper a memo that there was a problem with the distance issue and the positioning. And Cooper basically said, well, I don't want to argue there was a conspiracy and we don't have any other conspirators. And doesn't that make him look more guilty? Never seemed to cross his mind that Sirhan could be actually innocent and completely manipulated.
Did you have a question,
man.
Rick?
Yeah,
I know
I
that
just-
you
I just think it's
recently
pretty
talked
freaking
about
weird.
MK Ultra on the show.
Yeah, pretty
so-
weird stuff. Pretty
Yeah.
weird.
People have read that chapter like it totally freaked me out. So
Well, our audience is kind of up to speed on MK Ultra on
Well,
Maverick
yeah,
News.
and I mean, a lot of people would
They
say that
understand
MK
a
Ultra
lot.
is a conspiracy theory, but they did the the
Oh,
experiment
it was a
at a
real
hospital
program.
right up here in Montreal, and they have a class
Oh,
action
they do.
lawsuit here in Canada ongoing right now. We had one of a lady on who's one of the main players in that, and laid the whole thing. It's not a conspiracy theory; it's a real
No.
thing, and Canada was part of all of that.
Absolutely.
in
And
the
I
case
want to
of- go
caution
ahead.
people that, hold on for a second, MK Ultra was only one of the many mind control programs. And I don't think Sirhan was in MK Ultra. I think he was part of Operation Artichoke, which was a different program. So it's important that we get things right and not overgeneralize, because then it's really easy to put us all down. So it's like, if we don't know, he was definitely under some form of mind control, but I've seen nothing that indicates it was the MK Ultra program. Let's put it that way. Whereas in Artichoke, there was a document that talks about, can we get a person of blanked out, redacted origin to commit an act of attempted assassination as part of a larger operation? And that's almost exactly what happened in the pantry. They got a foreign person to commit an act that looked like assassination, but wasn't, because he was firing blanks. And again, I know Paul would have come to this because he was slowly moving in that direction, but he didn't get that far. But he was completely wrong. Sirhan's bullets, because they had actually saved 3 test bullets from Sirhan's gun, and I know they would have pretended those were victim bullets if they could have matched them to any one real bullet in the pantry. Wolfer even stuck one away. He claimed it was lost in the water barrel, and I hear that sometimes that happens, but I don't buy it. I think he was holding his side so that he could match it to any one of the victim bullets, and they never could, because Sirhan wasn't firing bullets. He was firing blanks. So you can't even charge him with anything against any of the other victims. He shot no one. And that fits everything that the people who knew him said. He was a nice guy. He was not the type to pick up a gun and shoot somebody. It's like he would take bugs and let them go out of the house. It's like he was not a killer in any sense of the word. And so, like I said, Paul and I had a huge disagreement over that, but I know I'm right from the evidence. No one has proven me wrong in the 5 years now that my book has been out. No one has said, oh, look, you missed this document. This proves that Sirhan. No, because it's not there. He didn't fire bullets.
Well, Paul Schrade was a dear friend of mine, and I loved him so much. And we lost him last November at the age of 97. But, you and I know who he is, but our audience doesn't. Would you like to tell the audience about who was Paul Schrade? He's a very important
he was a
man
labor organizer. Yeah, he was a labor organizer with the United Auto Workers, who was passionate about Robert Kennedy's campaign, and he was passionate about what Cesar Chavez was doing. And late into life, I got to know him obviously through this case, but I also got to know him because every time I would go to some liberal activist event in LA, Paul Schrade would be there. So I talked to him, several times over the years, and we had a great relationship until my book came out, because I just have to say, it's like nothing to him was a fact until he said it first. And the fact that I kind of beat him to this punch, I think, was hard for him to swallow, because why didn't he see it? And like I said, he was coming around, but there weren't enough years left, unfortunately.
Paul, he spent some 40 plus years of his life trying to get down to the bottom of what happened that night in the Ambassador Hotel pantry. I should point out
we
that
have
Paul,
him to thank for the files. It's like we wouldn't even have those files if Paul hadn't pried them free.
Yes.
The sad thing is he took all his time getting them free, and then he didn't go through and read the ones that told what happened.
Interesting.
So, but who's to know? And he for years put down Lynn Mangan and, oh, she's wrong, and this and that and this. And again, they became good friends before he died because he was coming around. So yeah,
I'm going to tell you a personal story. And you may have heard this on my interview with George Galloway. When I was working with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. right here back in 2007, 2008, was trying to draft Kennedy to run for president. Even back then, this was 16 years ago. And during that time, Paul Schrade asked me personally to reach out to Bobby on his behalf and bring him evidence that Paul had in these files, the autopsy, and most importantly, the Brzezinski recording, which is a vital piece of evidence in this case. And it had only just surfaced around that time after being stuck in the archives. Nobody paid any attention to it. So the Brzezinski recording, basically it was I think a radio or newspaper reporter had an audio recorder, a tape recorder with him back there in the room. And when the shots rang out, there was an audio recording made of the gunfire. And
Mm.
when that tape emerged some 40 years later, it was analyzed by experts who isolated, I believe, at least a
13.
minimum of
At
13
least 13.
gunshot
Mhm.
sounds, which of course means that Sirhan was not acting
Couldn't have been
alone.
alone.
He
Right.
only had an 8-shot revolver. You can't get 13 shots out of an 8-shot revolver. So Paul was very excited about trying to convince members of the Kennedy family to join him in his efforts to get the case reopened. Sort of like what the Dr. King's family did in the 90s when
Yes.
they sued the government. So
Right.
Paul Schrade reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you get this evidence to Bobby?"
How did you know Paul?
He literally found me. He tracked me
Oh,
down.
oh, funny. Okay.
Paul was, a very determined man.
Oh, yes.
Very
Yes, he was.
persuasive man, and he didn't take no for an answer, which I loved about him. He was so determined to get to the truth, and a very charming and witty and wonderful human being. So he reached out to me. We developed a friendship. I have probably 12 or 13 hours of phone interviews that I did with Paul about this case. And during that time, he was on a crusade to try and educate the Kennedy family, the Ethel and the kids.
God bless him for
And
that.
he was,
Yes.
bless him for that. But Lisa, he got the door slammed on his nose. Every member
No.
of the Kennedy family, including Ethel, said, "Go away, Paul." And that was heartbreaking to him because he was a close friend of Bobby Kennedy's. He was also close to Jack Kennedy. He'd been a labor organizer on the 1960 campaign for JFK, and then was labor organizer on Bobby's campaign, very close friends. And so it broke Paul's heart when the Kennedys did not want to talk to him. They didn't want to look at his evidence. In the family, there has always been this accepted dogma that Sirhan did it. He's guilty. We're not talking about it, period.
Yeah.
And it was at that time that I said, "Okay, Paul, look, I will go to Bobby and I'll take him your evidence, but don't get your hopes up, man, because I've tried talking to him about JFK. I've tried talking about his father's case. He does not want to go there. He's just not, it's too painful, too traumatic. He just doesn't want to do it." And so for months on end, for the better part of a year, I was like this courier between Paul Schrade and Bobby Kennedy. And I'm relaying packages, I'm sending him tons of evidence that Paul would send me DVDs and copies of paperwork. And I would send these huge fat packages to Bobby. And I honestly think that he put them on a shelf somewhere and just never really looked at them. When Bobby came to LA, Paul wanted to meet with him. And I said, you could at least have lunch with the man. What harm would it do if here's his phone number? So I'm the one who gave him Paul Schrade's number. And I said, just call him. Just call him. Just you talk to him for 30 minutes. And I knew that if Paul could just talk to Bobby for 30 minutes, he would get him interested. And Bobby has a curious mind, and he's a great lawyer. And he knows how to evaluate evidence. The question is, could he do so fairly and objectively in the case of his own father? So it took several years of trying to get Bobby to look at the evidence that Paul had. He finally did. That meeting between those two did finally happen. I'm so glad it did.
I am so grateful to you.
They became good friends, towards the end
I
of
would
his
never have
life.
met Bobby if you hadn't got him interested in those cases.
Well,
Because
there you
he
go.
actually had me over to his house because he lives in LA now.
Yep.
When he started, or when he was working on American Values, his previous book before the Fauci book.
I love that book.
And it's such a good book. It's such a good book. But originally, the book was going to have a chapter about the assassinations of JFK and Robert Kennedy. And he was trying to condense it all down into, like one chapter.
Good luck.
And I and other researchers are like, you might want to rethink that because there's so much to say and it's hard to prove anything in that small space. Look how many pages it took me, like 800 pages to try and make my case, or 500 pages with 800 footnotes.
Right. And it's a lifetime of work for someone like you.
Oh yeah, like I said, it's easily I've been at this now more than 30 years. So it's just yeah, people who are get into the case and they read 2 or 3 books and then they write their own book on the case. They're usually not very good because you
Mhm.
kind of need to know what's already been said to know what's new and what's important and what's different. And
Right.
I read
And
all the other books on the Robert Kennedy case before I wrote my own, and some were very good, and some were terrible, and some were just kind of a summary of everything that had come before and nothing new. So, but yeah, Bobby's interest now is of course very genuine. And the day Thane Eugene Caesar died, he called me. He's like, Lisa, I need that
mm,
picture of Thane. It's in Dan Moldea's book. Do you have it? I'm like, I think I do. And he's like, well, come over anyways, like, because I know I have it here somewhere. And so he literally like sent me looking, through his books to help him find it. And then he was drafting his post. And I brought over something I hadn't shared with him previously. And those were the files where I dug up that proved Thane Caesar worked for the CIA. And he's like, oh, this is great. And I was like, I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was afraid you'd go blab about it before my book came out. And that was like one of the big new things I had in my book. So, but I mean, just isn't that chilling that literally the guy holding Kennedy's elbow as he's being shot and maybe shooting him himself worked for the CIA in later years and probably at that time too. He was
most likely.
ostensibly moonlighting as a plumber at the Skunks Work facility in the valley here, San Fernando Valley, which required like CIA clearance because those were the CIA spy planes being developed there. He was
Right.
also moonlighting as a bodyguard for Robert Mayhew, serving Howard Hughes. I mean, he was a bodyguard for Howard Hughes, hired by Robert Mayhew. And Robert Mayhew's fingerprints are kind of all over this case. Mayhew got into the CIA through the mind control guys. Those are the guys who brought him in and said, all these mobsters, we've got all this mind control stuff. This seems like a match made in heaven. If we can get the mobsters to do what we want them to do, we could really get a lot done and have total, wash our hands of it. Because it's really easy to blame the mob. Everybody believes it. They're dirty criminals. They'll do anything for money. It's a great cover for the CIA to get their operations done. And
so do
the
you think
CIA's
Howard Hughes had any attachment to this at all?
I would have said no, although I met a guy who worked for him. And the thing is, Howard Hughes, how do I want to say? At least this is what I know for a fact, because I don't like to speculate about what I don't know. So I don't know if he was in on it beforehand, and I really don't think he was, because Mayhew did things for the CIA without telling Hughes about them. For example, he was working on the anti-Castro plots and never told Hughes about them. Hughes later asked, why are you spending so much time in Miami? And Mayhew got permission from CIA to tell Howard Hughes about it. But immediately after the assassination, Hughes watched like 26 hours of continuous coverage until Robert Kennedy died. And then as soon as Robert Kennedy died, he pulled out his yellow lined paper because he and Mayhew never communicated by phone. They only communicated by notes. He wrote a long letter to Mayhew saying, okay, we got this whole Kennedy organization now and they're totally leaderless. And now's our time to make a move because we can hire them to be lobbyists for us in Washington because Howard Hughes wanted to stop the atomic testing in Nevada because he was worried personally about his own safety, that radiation would kill him. And he was then living in the top floor of a casino in Nevada. So it wasn't out of any great liberal concern for the earth. It was just personal. He didn't want radiation in his air and he was paranoid about germs and things. And so he was literally willing to hire the whole Kennedy apparatus and throw them at Nixon and try and get him to stop the testing of, nuclear weapons there.
And for people who are too young to know, Howard Hughes was sort of the Elon Musk of his day.
That's a great comparison.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
One of the richest men in the world at the time. He a lot of government contracts. His father handed over the family wealth from
the drill bits.
The drill bits
and
that were used in the oil industry at the time.
Yeah,
and then he became a very eccentric hermit, essentially living in his own hotel in Vegas. And today you still see his legacy on the street signs in Vegas, and and even in satellites, because he was involved in the aerospace industry. And anyway, also very involved in politics, and tried to manipulate presidents and influence national and international politics, and he had the money to do it. And Robert Mayhew, was Howard Hughes's main
Top
handler.
man in Las
Yeah,
Vegas.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And he was kind of the public face. Since Howard Hughes didn't do media interviews, he would always send Robert Mayhew. Now,
And
Hughes
later
had
became
gone-
a key figure of these guys in the Watergate scandal as well,
And
because I
even
was all
Iran
involved in the break-in.
Contra,
Right?
some of the money for the Iran Contra thing came from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Florida.
Yeah.
Now, the CIA and Hughes was like a match made in heaven, since Howard Hughes controlled the patents for the only drill bit that really chewed through rock enough to get to the oil. And so anywhere oil was discovered in the world, the Hughes organization would know about it because somebody would apply to use their drill bit. And then the CIA could see where the oil was all over the world. So it was truly, for them, a match made in heaven. But, for the Kennedys, a match made in hell, because I'm pretty sure it was Howard Hughes's money, whether he knew it or not, that paid for the assassination.
Right.
That's how they
So
do
where
it.
do you think all of this leaves us? Like, after all of the work that you've done and, the evidence that you have looked at, where do you think this leaves Sirhan? Is there any possibility that
He should be
might
free.
get out of jail?
He should be freed. And here's the thing. The more people who read the book, the more will know and be able to speak to the evidence and can convince others. And they tell two people and so on and so on. Because I really think if enough people call for his release, he will be released. And in fact, the year that Bobby Kennedy spoke up, in behalf of Sirhan for parole, and his brother Doug also did the same thing. By the way, I was the one who got Bobby to meet with Sirhan. I'm literally sitting with him in his kitchen as we're working on the American value stuff. I said, by the way, would you like to see Sirhan? I said, because I can get his lawyer on the phone right now. And he's like, yes. So I called then Lori Dusick, who was working with William Pepper, and got them together. But I think, honestly, if the Kennedy family, beyond Bobby and Doug, were to see this evidence somehow, some friend of theirs reads it and goes, my God, you have to learn about this, I think that would get Sirhan freed. I'm so sad. I mean, here Kerry runs an international human rights organization, the Robert Kennedy Center, the Robert Kennedy Foundation for human rights, but she won't consider the possibility that Sirhan himself is a victim. And I do understand, because they had family and friends who were in the pantry when the shooting went down. And so some of them saw Sirhan standing there with a gun. So it's really hard to get that image out of your head. It's like, yes, he was there. Yes, he had a gun. Yes, he was firing, but no, it was blanks. It just sounds crazy until you look at the evidence. And I mean, a really hard, deep look into the evidence, which I tried to give people in my book.
Yeah, well, it is a lot to digest, a lot of detail in your book. I'm very impressed with the level of detail that you go into. You're very, very thorough. There's no question about that. And the assassination of Robert Kennedy changed the course of history. We wound up with Nixon and Watergate and more Vietnam. And oh my God, even now, like, how do you think what happened back then ties into what we're seeing today? And I think there's probably a lot to be said about that, especially now with RFK Jr. Seeking the presidency.
Yeah, it's I don't want to make it as simple as we have the forces of darkness and the forces of the light, but in a way, that's kind of how it feels. When I grew up, the Kennedys were the Democrats, because I was born in 61 and, John Kennedy was president. So it wasn't until many years later that I realized what an anomaly Kennedy Democrats were relative to the rest of the Democratic Party. And both parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans, have moved much further right than they ever have been in my entire lifetime. I mean, truly, it's like the Republicans in Congress right now, it's like the fascist party. And the Democrats in Congress are like the Republicans of my youth, a lot more moderate, but still fairly conservative. Now, I will say both Obama and Biden have been more liberal than, say, the Clintons were. And, so there's been a little bit of a shift back to the left in that sense. Robert Kennedy is different because part of him is things that appeal to the Republicans, and part of him is going to appeal to the Democrats. As somebody who did hunting in his youth, I don't know what his stance is on gun control. I've never asked him. But I do know he's certainly pro-environment and probably the best president we could have, given the global climate change crisis, that we're facing. We need somebody who truly understands this issue in a way that Biden doesn't, because Biden is still giving subsidies to oil companies, and, they're never going to change their ways until they have to, until it becomes illegal to keep producing oil. And it's not like we could come full circle and pick up where we left off, which would be so nice if we could. That doesn't really happen. But we are at a real inflection point in this country. We could go in a radically fascist dictatorship direction. I always argued right from the start that Trump was never running to be president. He was always running to be dictator. So when one of his first acts was to call for a military parade in D.C., which fortunately was not approved, that didn't surprise me in the least. That shocked some people, but it didn't surprise me because that's what dictators do. He used to sleep with Mein Kampf at his bedside, according to one of his ex-wives. And it's like,
I'd never heard that.
One of his, I think it was his first ex-wife, because everything he did.
You mean
was
his
bad
late
after what
ex-wife?
Hitler did.
The one who fell down the stairs and died?
Not that. I think it was the one prior. But yeah,
you're telling me that one of his ex-wives said that he used to sleep with Mein Kampf on his bedside table?
Google it. It's out
Trump?
there. I mean, yep. It's not.
Okay.
Gotta look into that one more. There's
I'm intrigued now.
I'm gonna have to see some evidence on that one. But
Well, it'll be a hell of a
there.
race if he goes up against Donald Trump. And of course, full disclosure, I'm a volunteer on the Kennedy campaign. Obviously, I've been trying to get this man to run since 2008. I'm so happy that he's in the race. I think he's the man to save America.
And I do think he could beat Trump easily, because I think
I see him as a populist candidate, which is why I see this sort of dovetailing of support from even MAGA people.
Yes.
Do you want to speak to that? Why do you see sort of crossover support between
In fact, I'm going to
parties?
draw you a little circle here. All right. What is the word like? Oh my God, it's going to look so dumb.
A picture to illustrate the point.
See this here? Okay. I think of politics as a circle. Most people think of it as a line with the left and the right. I think of it as a circle. The Democrats on the left, well, whatever side they're on, the Democrats here and the Republicans here. All right. At the bottom where they meet is kind of total fascism, totalitarianism, either like communism, dictatorship by a party, or, dictatorship by a person at the extreme far right. At the extreme left, you have anarchy and libertarianism, where it's like as little government as possible, as much government as possible. And so MAGA, and I also think of below this kind of middle line, if I drew a line through the middle, which I will, below that line, let's try and get where you can see it. Below the line are the forces of war and intervention. We have the right to control the world. Above that line is people who say America first. We want to feed our, poor and hungry and starving and take care of our needs and healthcare for all. And I think MAGA and the liberals have more in common than they think, because they're both anti-war. And this is what a lot of Democrats don't do, because they're looking at it, divided this
left
way.
and right. Yeah.
They're looking at left and right instead of top and bottom. And like I said, I think that's why Robert Kennedy speaks to that top half, the MAGA, the liberals, the libertarians, and the extreme liberals on the left, because they kind of meet in that upper quadrant where they don't want to intervene in the rest of the world unless we have to. And
where on that chart do the crazy people fall?
All over it. There are crazy people in every political persuasion. They're dotted
That's
throughout.
right.
Well, that's a great point. And also, I want to point out that another thing that the progressive left and the MAGA people have in common is that they're both working class movements. And as Bobby made clear in his announcement speech in Boston on April 19th, just like his dad, he is a working class candidate. He's not
Right.
there to represent the interests of big corporations in Washington. He feels a responsibility to be the representative for the vast majority of Americans who can't afford lobbyists, whose interests are not being represented even in Congress with the people that they elect to send to Washington to represent them. And so that's something I feel that his campaign has very much in common with his father's campaign. And, he talks about that in his speech, how in 1968, his father's chances, we tend to over romanticize the Robert Kennedy quest for the White House now, and people say, "Oh, he was a shoo-in. He was going to be president." And
no, it's going to be an uphill battle. Yeah, they had super delegates then too.
That's not true. He had a very hard race ahead of him. He was not favored by the party bosses. Hubert Humphrey was favored because he was the vice president of the United States.
Hubert Humphrey was so secure, he didn't even enter some of the primaries.
That's right.
Because they didn't have to.
Yep.
And this is something that I think the Democratic Party needs to take a long, hard look at. Either we're the party where the primaries matter, or the party that doesn't give a crap about, the people's vote in the primary. And we saw that happen with Bernie and Hillary in 2016. There was a lot of support for Bernie, and there was party just couldn't have anything to do with Bernie.
Which was again in 2020. They did it again.
In 2020, they had all these other candidates that all lumped behind Biden, and
right up to South Carolina.
All. Yeah. So
Lisa, do you think RFK Jr. actually has a shot, or is the machine rigged against him?
Did you have to put it that way, Rick?
Yes, I did.
All right, I'm gonna I'll talk about something Robert Kennedy, the father, said. He's like, because I think Roger Mudd was interviewing him, and he's like, "Why do you always talk like you're gonna win?" And he's like, "Because that's the only way you can talk." And so I'm not going to say anything like I don't think he has a chance, because I think he does have a chance. And in anything, there's a possibility for negative and a possibility for the positive. I have no reason not to focus on the positive chance that Bobby could win until it's too late. And then it's
who are we looking at? Who's in the race now? You've got Biden, RFK Jr., and who else?
And Marianne Williamson.
Yeah, so Biden falls down 2 or 3 more times. RFK Jr. wins.
Did you hear about what he did just 2 days ago? When Biden fell down and couldn't get up, and then was all disoriented and didn't know where he was, and then hit his head going into the airplane. And I'm like, oh my God, this is just embarrassing.
It is embarrassing. It's very embarrassing.
And the sad thing is, I think Biden's team is running the government, and I actually think they're doing a pretty good job. I'm not completely unhappy. I could definitely be unhappy with parts of it, but overall, they're not doing bad. They're just not doing enough good.
They're just not doing very good either.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, it depends on who you talk to.
Matter of opinion, yes.
I have to be honest, I'm not happy, and I'm not even an American.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm super happy that they finally got Medicare the right to negotiate drug prices for the elderly. I mean, not just for the elderly, but just to negotiate drug prices, period. The infrastructure bill had some really good things in it. There are some nods to the environment that haven't been there in the past. They made it through the debt crisis, but I'm not crazy about what we did in Ukraine. And, we basically punched I was going to say Stalin, Putin. It's like, we punched him until he fought back. But my analogy for that is, if you're being bullied by a kid at school, yes, you have a right to fight back. What you don't have a right to do is pull out a gun and shoot the bully. And that's what I think Putin has done. He literally rolled tanks across the border. So it's like whatever sympathy I had for Putin stopped at that point. So at that point, I'm on the side of the Ukrainians, even though, yes, he was provoked. Yes, his country has been threatened, and now they're talking about invading Russia, something they always said they weren't going to do, and now there's talk that they're
I
going to do
wouldn't
it.
do that if I were you.
Yeah.
The Nazis thought they could invade Russia, and so did Napoleon.
Exactly.
It didn't work
Doesn't
out
usually
well.
work.
Just
Well,
saying.
in the current world, invading any other country just doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's
That's
what I
what we
also thought
do. We're the
Putin had
United
lost.
States, baby.
I know,
I mean,
but we never win.
we're going to
We
liberate the
never
shit
get it
out of
long.
you.
Look what happened with Vietnam. It's like they're thriving and we're not there. It's like, Guatemala has fended us off how many times now?
Right.
Brazil, we keep overthrowing their liberal leaders and they keep installing a new one. It's like we never succeed at this. Why do we keep doing it? It makes me so angry. Regime change should not be part of our menu.
Well, and that is exactly why I'm supporting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president.
Exactly.
Regardless
he wouldn't do that.
of which side you may support in the current war, whether you support Russia or Ukraine, or you just not
I just want the war
either
to
side.
end.
Most of us, I think, just want this war to end because we see the dangers of playing this kind of game of chicken with a nuclear armed power. And as Bobby rightly points out, a nuclear power that has more nuclear weapons than we do. So I don't think it's a good idea myself. I think it's a really, really bad idea. And Bobby has been consistently anti-war since his teens back during the Vietnam era. And he's never wavered on that. I know that we can trust that if this war is still going and we're all still here and we haven't blown up in a nuclear fireball by January of 2025 when he
is entirely possible in the current
that he will make stopping this war a priority one way or the other. I think that he can negotiate peace between the two sides if someone hasn't done it before then, and I hope they do. I don't have much faith that Joe Biden will do that. But I wanted to, before we conclude, Rick, there's a picture that I have queued up that I wanted to show everyone. You were talking about being in the kitchen with Bobby. There you are. And
right
was this
behind
taken
is
the
that
day
library.
that Thane Eugene Caesar died?
Yes.
Okay, so
Like
there's
said,
a
he called me
story.
over to help with his post, and of course I told him I don't believe Thane Caesar did kill his father, and the reasons for that are in my book. I think he held him in place. I think he shot him under the arm. I do think it was a guy in a white busboy uniform who shot him in the head.
So you
and
believe
that was
that
the only fatal
busboy
shot.
did the fatal shot to the ear, correct?
So I believe what?
You believe that the busboy delivered the fatal shot to the ear. Is that right?
Busboy, a guy dressed as a busboy.
A guy
I don't
dressed
think it was
as
a
a
real
busboy.
busboy. I don't think it was a
So
real busboy in a
Bobby
million years.
disagrees, right? And he believes it was Caesar.
But again, he's new to this, and I've been
Right.
at this for 25
That's
years.
right. He's got some catching up to do.
As I told him, he's like, Lisa, you're so far ahead of me on this. He's like, I can only go with what I know. And I said, I totally understand. And I was where he was at one point. I assumed
Me too.
it was
Me
Caesar
too.
because that's all I knew. And then
Yeah.
I learned a little more. And now I still think, like I said, Caesar was absolutely getting him killed. But I think his job might have been to hold him in place and try to kill him from the side. But if he'd put his hand up there, everybody would have seen it. He was so big and tall. He couldn't hide that.
Well,
he could, however, hide it on the way down.
There are
he was
witnesses that I've seen interviewed on the news that night in 1968 saying that they saw a security guard with his gun drawn.
Yes.
Some say that they saw the security guard actually fire his weapon.
Well,
and I believe that Caesar admitted that he did, but he was
Schulman.
trying to protect Senator Kennedy, is how he put it.
Oh, yeah.
That's what he said. So
yeah, I don't
to
believe
tell
that
this
for a
story because it's a great story. Before we go, Bobby believed that his father's true killer was Thane Eugene Caesar, the rent-a-cop, and he tracked him down. And he was living in the Philippines?
Philippines, yes.
Yeah. So Bobby tracked him down and wanted to meet with him.
Yeah.
Which is stunning.
And he said, you have to go through my agent, Dan Moldea.
Dan Moldea. Yes.
Who I've long thought
handler.
is a spook. Yeah, I've
handler.
always thought Dan Moldea was a spook, a CIA guy. So.
Me too. I agree with you there. So Bobby tried to meet with him. And I guess Caesar said, okay, I'll meet with you for $10,000.
Oh, I thought it was like 50,000 or something.
Well, the initial offer was 10
What?
grand. And Bobby
Oh,
said, okay. He agreed. Okay.
oh
Which
wow.
is wild that he would actually pay to meet
Yeah.
the guy that he thinks murdered his dad. But
Yeah.
anyway, he said yes. And then back through the channel of Dan Maldea, then Caesar comes back with a counter offer and says, oh, that'll be 20 grand now. And that's when Bobby said no. And
Yeah.
shortly
It would have
after
kept going
that,
up. Yeah.
Thane Eugene Caesar died. That was
Mhm.
in 2020. Is that right?
Yeah, I was gonna say shortly after my book came out.
Ah,
Because I
yeah.
really have evidence that I think people could have taken to court against Caesar.
Yep.
And here's the funny thing. I know a major reporter at a major paper, and he said, Lisa, we have not been able to confirm that he's dead. And we have worked all our sources there. And this is
Say
something that also
what?
seemed to have happened to Frank Sturgis, one of the Watergate burglars.
Yeah.
Sometimes people can be made to die on paper while they're still living. And they just hide them away so that they don't get questioned or whatever. So I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know.
Interesting.
But that's the
Interesting.
final twist on that story.
Holy cow. So how old would Thane Eugene Caesar be if he was still
Well, he was
alive
in his
today?
20s then, so he'd
Yeah,
be
he
in
was
his
young.
70s now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
that
late
old.
70s, early 80s. Yeah,
The
yeah.
look on Rick's
Younger
face
than
right
mine.
now.
You guys are baking my brain.
Oh man, yeah, it's people, most people live normal lives and they don't do a lot of skullduggery and they're not criminals. And it's just impossible for them to imagine that there's people whose sole job is to think and act like a criminal as they work for an intelligence agency. Their whole life is building plots to kill people. They're
Right.
very good at what they do.
And not
You
only
know?
that, the CIA, they love magic. They love sleight of hand. They love
Yes.
trickery. They love
Yeah.
to fool you and mess around with your mind. And
That's
to
it.
my
I
mind,
claim this was a magic act in the
it
pantry.
is.
Like I said,
It
Sirhan
is.
is the magician's assistant, pulling all the focus. Every eye in the room goes to
Mhm.
him as soon as he pulls out a gun and starts firing. And the blanks actually make it better because the flame is visible. And so people know where to look. In a real
Mm.
gun, the flame is not visible. It's like
True.
you don't see the bullet coming out of the gun, but people see flame coming out and they feel like they saw the bullet come out. But the very fact that they saw the flame is also indication of blanks. And you can't believe how many ear witnesses said it sounded like a cap gun.
Yeah.
And I believe the
Pop,
other
pop,
guns
pop,
were
pop,
all
pop.
silenced and hidden and might have been in a cigarette case or, any of those CIA type weapons.
That's a
There's
great
so many
point.
ways
And when
to
you
hide.
listen to that Brzezinski recording, it does sound like a cap gun. It's pop, 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 pop.
Well, and the other thing is,
If
I
that's
on
the
that
case, why do you think they wanted him gone?
why
The
they
why?
wanted
Yeah,
Bobby
why
gone?
why did they want to kill him? If all of this is true, why?
Mhm.
What's the motivation?
Because
And does
Bobby had made it known to associates that he would reopen the investigation to his brother's death. The CIA had killed JFK,
Right.
and if Bobby got to the White House, he would absolutely, put them on trial basically for that.
Well, and he
was
would
one of the
also
country's
end their
best
war in
investigators.
Vietnam, which they were making a
Yes,
lot of money off of.
exactly. That's it. It's like the things they killed John Kennedy to stop, Bobby would just restart. Because both the Kennedys, here's the bottom line to me. Both of the Kennedys believed that there were three possibilities for nations. They could be a client state of America, they could be a client state of the USSR, or they could be independent. And that's something that no president has allowed since. They're either in our camp or they're our enemy. And Kennedy saw there should be a place for a neutral third ground for Castro, for Nasser, for any of the leaders in foreign countries, Goulart in Brazil, who got overthrown as soon as Kennedy was out, Sukarno in Indonesia, who was overthrown as soon as Kennedy was out. I mean, they were people who just believed we should do a fair deal with the rest of the world, not just take advantage of poor nations and strip them of their resources and turn them into little client states. And I really think that's why they were both killed in the end.
So I have a question for you, Lisa. Something that's always puzzled me, and I know you can't read a dead guy's mind, but I always wondered in your studies of Robert Kennedy, why he endorsed the Warren Commission report without question publicly from 1964 until just before his death in 1968, when he
I know.
finally, under pressure from I think a college kid, asked him, "Will you reopen the case?" And I think he finally meekly
He said,
muttered,
"No one is more interested in knowing
"Yeah,
who
yeah."
killed,
So
JFK than me."
why? Why was
Yeah.
he so silent?
I totally get it. And I get it because I met Christopher Kennedy Lawford, who is a cousin of the Kennedys. And he was out here doing a book signing of his very good book, by the way. And I had taken him a copy of The Assassinations. And during the Q&A afterwards, the audience, somebody said, "Do you believe the Warren Commission?" He's like, "Yeah, I believe it. I support that 100%. So afterwards, I went up to him. I said, "Well, you may not want to read this book because it's pretty much the opposite of what the Warren Commission said." I said, "But your kids may want to know the truth." And he looks at me and goes, "Are you kidding? I will totally read this. I'm so into this stuff." Complete opposite of what he had just said in public. And I think the reason is, one, they don't want to be targets themselves. Two, they don't want that label of conspiracy theory. All of them have big, important things to do in their lives, and they don't need that extra burden. In his own book, American Values, Bobby Kennedy is like, "I can't go after all the rumors and the crazy things said about our family. I would have no life. I could be like playing whack-a-mole all day long."
True.
And so I think it's like, unless Bobby, the father, RFK, Robert Kennedy, not Jr., but father, unless he could prove who did it, I don't think he wanted to say anything. He
Do you think
himself
he
was a
knew?
prosecutor.
The real question is, do you
I
think
don't think
he
he knew
knew?
for sure. He had friends looking into, did the CIA did it? Did the mob do it? Did the right wing do it? He had friends going out and investigating those different tracks. And I don't think he knew for sure, but his first instinct was the
His
CIA.
first
As
instinct, you know what
soon
they
as he was
say.
told, he called the
Yeah.
CIA's duty officer, said, "Did you
Mhm.
guys kill my brother?"
On
And
that
that's when
day.
McCone comes running out to the house.
Yep.
And McCone's, and he's like, "I asked him in a way that he couldn't lie to me." McCone wasn't even in the loop in the Castro
No.
assassination plots. He was a
No.
Kennedy appointee. No way were they going to loop him in. When
Right.
we say the CIA killed them, I don't mean the top level guys. I don't mean like an official CIA operation from the president of the CIA on down. I mean, there is no president, you know what I mean? But McCone wasn't in the loop on that stuff. And so, Bobby might have thought he knew more than he did. But McCone just didn't know. And I don't know if McCone would have told him the truth if he did. That I don't know. But I
Right.
do know that the CIA guys involved would never have included McCone in the plot. He wasn't part of the inside cabal, so
Yeah.
to speak, which included Ellen Dulles, even in absentia.
Right.
And James Angleton, who had manipulated Oswald but handed off his file at the last minute, possibly to wipe his hands of that. And then Angleton ends up with the autopsy photos of Robert Kennedy in his safe, which are discovered after he's ousted from CIA. And Angleton was also, I understand, in touch with Robert Mayhew. And Angleton is literally the only. There was a very tiny funeral for E. Howard Hughes, and just a handful of people evidently were allowed in. Angleton was one of them.
Wait, you mean E. Howard
Howard
Hunt or
Hughes.
Howard Hughes?
Howard Hughes, the billionaire.
Howard Hughes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was somebody had brought that to me. I'm like, that's almost too good to be true, but it was true. He really went there. Yeah. So there's actually a whole story behind Howard Hughes. I'll just leave this.
Oh, there's so many stories we could tell about him.
Honestly, there's good evidence he was dead a year before he was officially declared dead.
I've heard that.
The CIA was in the process of transferring his assets to the Summa Corp, which should have been everybody's clue, because up until that time, every Howard Hughes organization bore his name because he's an incredible egoist. Everything was the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Howard Hughes this, the Howard Hughes that, Howard Hughes Aircraft. So to have a corporation called the Summa Corporation, you had to know that wasn't Howard Hughes if you were in the know. But it's as if he died before they could complete the paperwork. So they had to keep him alive on paper until all the funds were wrapped up. And then
Have
he
you,
could
are
be
you
allowed
like,
to
have you
die.
done a lot of research into Hughes? We should have you back on for another show about
Oh,
that.
that'd be good.
Oh my God. I was
Yeah,
gonna
I'd
say,
love
you can't
that.
really see my shelf, but I got like a whole bunch of books on Hughes behind me.
Okay,
I actually
okay,
had
we're
You need
paying
to
you
write a
back. We
book
gotta,
about Hughes.
yeah, we
I
have
know.
to get you
I
back
feel
on
like
to talk
somebody
about
needs
that.
to. There's a really good book about Hughes called Age of Secrets. I highly recommend you read it.
I haven't read
John
that.
Meyer wrote it because he had worked with Mayhew. They used to share an office, and he has more to tell than what was in that book. But he's fascinating. And I've met his family, and yeah, they're good people who got caught in a really crazy situation there.
So,
yeah.
okay, so we're going to do that. We're getting you back on to talk about Howard Hughes. I don't know when
Oh
we're going to
my
pick it. We're going to
God.
pick an anniversary
I was
date.
gonna say
And
I
what we're,
haven't looked
and
into
what
that
we're going to
stuff in a
do
while.
is folks, there's a movie out there called The Aviator with
There you go.
Leonardo DiCaprio. If you don't know, because you're too young, who Howard Hughes was, just go watch that movie. That'll be a good primer for you. And before we do the episode with Lisa on Howard Hughes, who was at the time, I think, one of the most, I don't know, colorful figures of his day,
Not to
Larger
mention
than
newspaper.
life.
wealthy and powerful.
He was
Yes,
a
yeah.
Texan. They're all larger than life, right?
So yeah,
Everything's
definitely got to
bigger in
do
Texas.
that. That will be a
Right.
great show too.
Yeah, I met the screenwriter of that, Josh Logan. Not Logan, but I forget his last name. But I met him at a screening, and I'm like, you should have started your movie where it ended, because that's where it gets really interesting. And I
That's
asked him
right.
if he had read Age of Secrets, and he's like, yes. And but I don't think the studios would have produced a true story.
Oh heck,
Well, I want
JFK.
to talk about the CIA in Hollywood.
He had nothing on Howard Hughes. Hughes was a huge womanizer, man.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm looking forward to doing
He
that
kept
interview with you.
women. He kept them like practically locked up.
Yeah,
and would get
well, he
really
was
upset if
he
they left.
collected them.
Yeah, my publisher, Feral House, the guy who ran Feral House before he died, at one point their office was abutting an old Howard Hughes property where he had kept one of his women, and she wasn't allowed to leave the property. And it was like a little ranch house with a little pool, and
Oh,
but
save
if
this
he
stuff.
went
We
there, he
save it,
wanted
save
her
it, save it.
waiting.
We got to save this stuff. It's so juicy. This is just a teaser. It's if you oh my goodness, this is.
Can you
just
stay
so
for another hour?
I'll
scandalous.
have to go back and reread some books, but maybe what I remember is enough.
Oh,
yeah.
the starlets that he romanced and
Oh,
wined
yeah.
and dined.
My gosh.
Oh
And
my
he made
goodness.
JFK look like an amateur, probably.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. JFK got
Yeah.
Marilyn Monroe, but he had Rita Hayworth.
Maybe. I don't
Yeah,
know.
maybe.
I don't
Well,
know.
yeah, the JFK Marilyn Monroe stuff. There's an
So
author.
exaggerated.
Yeah, exactly. There, at best, there was a one-night encounter. At best,
At best.
and there was
If that
no
even happens.
long-term thing at all. And there was nothing between Bobby and Marilyn. And she even said like he wasn't my type.
I never believed any of that crap, but most people do.
I know.
So far removed
It's
from
easy
it
to
now.
believe when you hear these things in absentia without, hearing the other side of the evidence.
Well, and this is the point that I always try to make to people when they talk to me as a Kennedy historian. You're more of an RFK historian. I'm more of a JFK historian, but people come to me and they tell me all these crazy stories that they saw on some documentary on the internet somewhere about all these things that Kennedy supposedly did, which I know for a fact he did not do.
Right.
And when I try to explain it to them, I'm trying to break through their programming because Lisa, you know as well as I do that MK Ultra is still around. There's still plenty of brainwashing going on, and
it's called programming for a reason on TV, right?
there you go.
TV, internet,
exactly.
social media. Talk about
Yeah,
programming.
so much fake news out there, and
Oh yeah.
when you because you've traced it back, you've done the research, and you know that when you really take these stories and you hold them up to the light and you examine them closely under a microscope, you trace them back to their original source, who started that story. It's almost always 100% of the time someone who was connected to the CIA. And so you've got
Right.
all these various stories. For example, in the JFK assassination, there's all these different theories, right? There's the Oswald
Mhm.
did it theory, the official theory. You've got
Mhm.
the mob did it theory, the Castro did it theory, the
The
KGB
Russians
did it
did it.
theory, the
George
Russia
Bush
did it
did it.
theory,
Yeah, yeah.
and my personal favorite, the Lyndon Johnson did it theory, which is total hogwash.
Yeah.
I've been debunking that one for years. But people really believe it because it's been trained into their head over and over and over again. And I'm like,
Big
God,
lies work. If you tell the same lie over and over, people assume it's true because who would tell
exactly.
such a big lie?
And
It
not
just
just that, it's like the
yeah.
title of your book, A Lie Too Big to Fail, right? They
Right.
told this big
Right.
lie and it's too big to fail, even if you come with the facts and say,
Mhm.
guys, here's the real evidence. Don't believe this BS over here, because what they're trying to do in spook speak, in spy speak, it's called a false sponsor of an
Mhm.
assassination, where they say, oh, this guy did it, that guy did it, look over here, look over there, just don't look at the CIA.
Yeah, I
Okay,
call them collectively the anybody but the CIA did it
there
theory.
you go. Yes, that's
'Cause
it.
they
So my advice to our listeners out there, when you hear a story about Jack Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy, be sure that you check that out before you accept it as the gospel.
really check it out. Like the Castro assassination plots is a perfect case in
There
point
you go.
because all my life I'd read the Kennedys approved it, Kennedys proved it. And I just, in my heart, I felt that can't be true. And so I thought, I'm going to go to every book that ever said that. I'm going to see what their source is. And guess what? It was always one guy, Sam Halpern, who was Richard Helms' assistant when Helms was DCI, head of Central Intelligence.
Perfect
And I'm
example.
like, well, isn't that interesting? And so then I looked further back, and Sam Halpern claimed he got it from Richard Bissell. Under oath,
Mm,
Richard Bissell's like, no, Kennedy didn't know anything about these plots. And I'm like,
okay.
Sam Halpern just made that up. And John Newman, who's one of the big researchers in the JFK case and a former intelligence analyst and stuff, and there are some files scattered through that seem to indicate the Kennedys might have known something, but in every case, I actually, because I was dogged about this, I started tracking them down. What's the follow-up document in response? And all of them put the lie to it. And in the
Mhm.
CIA's IG report, which was kept classified until the 1990s, so
Right.
long after the Kennedys were gone, finally the report was released to very little fanfare. And in only 2 pages of the report, they make it super clear. Did the CIA, have any direction from the Kennedys to kill Castro? And both places, they're like, no, we really didn't. And they only told the Kennedys about the plots that had ended, and they didn't say anything about the plots they were still doing. That's how insubordinate the CIA was. And when you understand that level of insubordinacy, it's much easier to believe if they felt they knew better than the president, why not kill the president and get one that is more in line with your own thinking? And
Regime change.
LBJ, right. And
Mm,
LBJ was in line with your thinking, but I'm with you, Lori. I've looked and I've looked. I've never seen any good evidence that
no.
LBJ was involved, but I've seen plenty of evidence after the fact. He helped with the cover up. But I think he did that out of fear. And I
Yeah.
also think if he had had the guts to kill the Kennedys, no way does he step down when Robert Kennedy is running. And
There
the
you
fact
go.
that he stepped down, it's like, I don't want to, it's like he was
Mm.
not the guy who killed them. He was not.
Well, I have to admit that I have some bias. I once believed that Lyndon Johnson was involved, and then I
Ah,
worked for the Johnson family. I lived in Austin, Texas for 25 years. I worked at a radio station
wow.
down there that the Johnsons owned called KLBJ Radio. And
Huh.
I actually knew Lady Bird, knew her quite well, knew Lucy Johnson. And I was able to take that deep dive because the LBJ Presidential Library was literally out my back door. And I had
Wow.
access to all of those primary source documents and was able to talk to the Johnson family about it. Now, of course, they're going to defend Lyndon, but
Yeah,
I came to find out that they were right, that there was no evidence. And
there
furthermore,
really isn't. Yeah.
it's important to point out that yes, there was enmity between RFK and LBJ. They were like two dogs that just didn't like the smell of one another. They got
Right.
that's the way
Right.
George Reedy put it. They just did not like each other from day one. It was a personality conflict, but people try to project RFK's hatred for Johnson onto JFK, and it's just not true. Jack
Mhm.
Kennedy liked Lyndon Johnson. He had great respect for Lyndon Johnson. He selected Lyndon Johnson to be his running mate in 1960. Don't believe all the conspiratorial crap you hear that somebody had a gun to his head, so to speak, saying you're going to take Johnson or else. Nobody told Jack Kennedy what to do. He was his own man. He made his own decision in Los Angeles in 1960. He knew
He needed the South. He needed the South. He
and it
needed
was
a
more than
Southern
that. Of course, he
Democrat.
couldn't have
Yeah.
won without Texas,
Yeah.
but there was more to it than that. Jack Kennedy was hiding a secret about his health from the public.
Yes.
He had already had the last rites read to him 3 times in his life. He almost died several times in his life.
I think that's
before
why
he
he was
became
so
president.
fearless, because when
Yes.
that happens, every
Yes.
day is a gift.
But
Yeah.
he was also a realist, and he knew that he might not survive his term.
Yeah.
And he wanted to make sure that whoever he picked to be his vice president was someone he could trust to
Mhm.
run the country and carry on his work. And I am a hearty opponent of the Vietnam War. I think it was a
Mhm.
terrible
Mhm.
decision that Lyndon made to take us into that war. Lyndon Johnson himself agonized over that decision for the rest of his life. I believe it killed him.
Yeah.
I truly believe he died of guilt over the 35,000 servicemen who died in that war. But Lyndon Johnson liked Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy liked Lyndon Johnson. The JFKs and the LBJs never had any issues. The issue was always Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And even after Robert Kennedy was murdered, some people even try to say that Lyndon had him killed, which just does
Oh,
not
God,
make any
ridiculous.
sense at
Yeah.
all.
There's no evidence for
It
that.
doesn't make any sense at all.
He had no
And
power
Lyndon
at
had
that
already
point.
bowed out of the race. He was
Yeah.
out. 2
Yeah.
weeks after Bobby got in, Lyndon got out, which was his way of saying, hey, you want this job? You can have this job. I hate this stinking job. I want out.
Exactly.
I want to go home to Texas,
Uh,
man. I'm tired of this thing. You can have it, Bobby. So I don't think Lyndon had anything to do with it. And Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird showed the Kennedy family incredible grace, incredible hospitality, and sweetness after the assassinations of John Kennedy and again after Robert Kennedy. Remember, all of Bobby's children, including Bobby Jr., were back east, except for, I think, one, David, who was out in
Mhm.
LA.
Mhm.
When the shooting happened, Lyndon Johnson sent Air Force Two to pick up the family and fly them across the country in a hurry so that they could get there in time to see their dad one last time and to say goodbye. And he put the full force of the United States government behind getting immediate Secret Service protection for presidential candidates, for passing
Mhm.
the Gun Control Act of 1968, which is not a law that I favor, but at the time, everyone was crying for it. After
Right.
the assassination of Dr. King and RFK, everyone was like, we've got to do something about guns. And so
Mhm.
Lyndon did something about guns. You may not like it, but he did it. And he did all in his power to try and smooth over the enmity and the bad blood between the Johnsons and the RFKs. But people often say the enmity was between the Johnsons and the Kennedys, and that's really not true. And
Yeah.
I try to set that fact straight every chance I get. So, what are your thoughts, Lisa, on the LBJ RFK rivalry?
Oh, I think it's the same thing. I think too that Robert Kennedy was, how do I want to say, kind of a moralistic Catholic, and in that sense, kind of a religious conservative almost, if you will. Whereas LBJ was kind of a whatever, let it all hang out kind of guy. I mean, they were like oil and water. They
They
just weren't
were.
ever gonna mix. And LBJ's style was very crude, and Bobby's was much more refined. And you know, they, even so, they probably had things in common too that we will never hear about. I'm sure I could imagine them on a hunting trip together or something. Maybe not so, it's just
Didn't they take it? Didn't yeah, Bobby paid a visit to the LBJ ranch in 1960, I believe. during the transition between Jack's victory and being sworn in, Bobby went down to the ranch, and of course, Lyndon took him hunting.
Yeah, I was gonna say I could totally believe
And
because
Bobby, there's Bobby trying to handle this big old shotgun. Obviously,
he's kind of a
just a
small
little
guy.
guy. He's like 5'7". The damn thing, the recoil blew him backwards, and he fell down.
Oh.
And of course, Lyndon never let him forget that one.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
It was an interesting
Yeah. No, I
relationship.
think most of us we hear things, we believe it's true, and I've started like not believing anything without more evidence. It's like somebody says something, I'm like, oh, that'd be interesting if that were true. It's like in my head, that's what I hear every time I hear something on TV, some big event. Oh, that'd be, I wonder if that's true. But I never just like, oh, that's interesting. It must be true. I question everything now. And I really encourage people, yeah, go look at some actual files. Sometimes people will say, like online, people are like, I don't know who to believe. You say this and this other guy says that. I'm like, go to the actual documents.
That's right.
You'll learn right away who's telling the truth.
Yes.
And I'm never shy about like sharing stuff or pointing people to things online, because once it's your guide to everything else, especially the JFK case. There's so many files and so many personalities. And if you find the people who are telling the truth about that, they're probably telling the truth about other things. And if they're lying about that, they're definitely lying about other things.
That's a really
So,
good rule of thumb for researchers out there. Absolutely. Especially
and
when you're looking into conspiracies. You've got to go with those
Yeah.
primary source documents every time.
and
One-
not
one-
all conspiracies are. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
One last
ahead, Rick.
question
Mhm.
from me for you.
Okay.
Do you think RFK Jr. is in danger?
Yes and no. And let me focus on the no, because Ellen Dulles isn't here anymore.
Thank
And the
God.
CIA has gone through a number of generations over the years. And I think they are much more outwardly focused and much less concerned, perhaps, about what happens here at home. And honestly, they have a bit of a friend in RFK because his daughter-in-law is CIA, and he has other friends who are CIA. His family grew up with the CIA. It's not the same thing. It's not JFK saying, I'm going to shatter the agency and throw it to the winds. And then JFK actually started to follow through on that because he built the Defense Intelligence Agency with the express goal of taking covert action out of CIA and putting it under DIA military control. That was his goal. And he got as far as creating the DIA, and then he was killed. So he wasn't able to corral all the operations. So I don't think the CIA has as much to fear as before. I'm not worried about a lone nut. We have pretty good Secret Service protection. Frankly, I think his biggest obstacle is the Democratic Party, because they are not the party of his father or his uncle anymore. They're not the party of FDR. There are people in the Democratic Party who hold those ideals, but the longer they've been in office, the more corrupt they get.
Right.
I think the only cure for America, to be perfectly honest, is publicly funded elections, because you have to take all that money out of the campaigning. And it should be a rotational thing where people, how do I want to say, almost like jury duty, where your employer has to cover you while you serve. Wouldn't it be awesome if they had to pay for you to be a congressional candidate or a senator or something for a few years? Because part of the problem is, if they become a senator, what do they do after? If they don't get reelected, what do they do for the rest of their lives?
Lobbying.
Exactly. It's
Private
like that's
sector
the
is
only
where the money
thing
is.
for. And so it's this revolving door. And so they don't want to piss off the lobbyists because they might need a job from them tomorrow.
Right.
And we have to find a way to separate that. And, I also think if we made Congress work for the minimum wage, we'd get a whole different set of people in there, and we'd have a much higher minimum wage.
I've been saying that for years. I'm like, pay Congress minimum wage, see how they like it. If you want the minimum wage to go up.
Then they can live like the real people. Yeah. So but do I think he's going to be killed? I really don't. Do I think the media is going to try and kill him? I absolutely do. And honestly, I worked for Howard Dean, and I saw how the media killed his campaign overnight.
Yep.
One
That
scream
one
that
scream.
didn't work, and they played
Didn't
it
end.
over and over, and that was the end. And that was sad because he was an intelligent, bright man, and could have done some good things for this country. In later years, I felt he was a bit of a sellout. I don't mind saying that, but
I
on the other
agree.
hand, he needed to make a living too. What else was he going to do? So um, it's hard running. It's hard, and that's also why I kind of like that Kennedy does have some independent wealth of his own. It's like he doesn't need to take money from lobbyists. He can be more independent. He could quit tomorrow and not lose any sleep over it. He doesn't have to worry about where his next meal is coming from, like some people might.
Well, that's one of the ways that Donald Trump was able to do it in 2015 was much of his campaign was self-funded. He
Yeah.
was independently wealthy and was not as reliant on corporate donations.
Which
although
was
he
one of the
did-
reasons
he
people
did
want to
take
vote
them,
for
though.
it. I was gonna say I've always thought of Trump as a grifter. I'm sorry if I offend anybody by that, but
Well, he made a
I
lot of money doing it. That's for
yes,
sure.
yes. And I know there are laws against that, and I think the only reason they haven't been enforced is that everybody in Congress is doing the same thing, and they don't want to set a precedent by going after him because then they might be next. So.
It's a big club, as George Carlin said, and you ain't in it.
That's right. That's right. But no, I think he has to get past the media. He has to get where people can hear him. I've been saying lately, freedom of speech isn't enough. We all need freedom of reach.
Yes.
If I'm censored every time I speak up on Twitter and my views are turned down, I can't. What's the point of having freedom of speech? I'm still alive, but if no one hears me, how does that help? And it's the same with Robert Kennedy. I think if people could hear him for themselves and not through the media filter, he'd get a ton of votes. But people hear him and they think, oh, he's anti-vax. And that isn't even his stance. As he said, his own kids have been vaccinated. He's anti the total unaccountability the vaccine makers have. You can't sue them. They're completely protected. And I can see where the government would want to give them a little more leeway. But
we are on YouTube, and we better just talk
Oh.
about something else.
Yeah. Anyway. Exactly.
Wink,
'cause
wink.
We get deplatformed for telling certain truths. I
Yeah,
guess.
they pulled my YouTube channel for talking
You
about
told me.
that, and
That's so
also
crazy.
talking about questioning what they call election integrity.
Yeah,
but
which means
but
means
they
we should
changed the
probably get to
rules.
this point
Did you know that, Rick? They changed the rules yesterday.
yesterday.
Yesterday,
Funny.
YouTube has
I
changed
don't
the
know
rules.
how many of you remember.
Not on
2000.
medical misinformation, but you can now question the 2020 election, which you couldn't do before, and they won't strike your channel. I don't know if you want to test that out, but
Well,
it is
and
a
here's
rule
the
change.
thing. I was arguing election fraud in 2000 and 2004.
Okay, I'm really scared right now.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the book
Yeah,
Okay,
because
no
I
worries.
cannot
Let's talk about
afford.
the book.
I don't want to go down that road
Anyway,
at all.
I didn't want to write this book. I really resisted it for many years. I only wrote it kind of because
Why?
I felt like if I didn't, God would be mad at me because I had all this information I wasn't sharing. And so I wrote it for that reason. And I tell people, if you can't buy it, I'm not in it to make money. I've never been in it to make money. Go to your library. You can even get the ebook version from the library. There's an audio version. If you don't like to read and you just want to listen, you can get it on audio. You can even get it on CD. You can get it any way you need to, but everybody should read this book. It isn't, by the way, just about the Robert Kennedy assassination, although that's the focus. But I do go into a little bit of the MLK assassination, the JFK assassination, the problems with the CIA and the media, why we can't find the truth so easily online or anywhere. I didn't talk about the CIA in Hollywood, but someday I want to write more about that because it's all over and it's very difficult. But the mind control stuff is very real because advertising is very sophisticated mind control. Right. And they've spent millions of dollars studying how to manipulate us into making decisions. And if advertisers can do it, imagine what others can do with it, the government. And so it's like anything, the more you know, the more you can protect yourself against it. When you start to recognize the patterns that repeat over and over across these cases, you'll see them coming the next time, I hope. So that's my goal. My hope in writing this book was to prevent further assassinations, because, as I say in the beginning, once you know how the magic trick works, you can't be fooled again.
Exactly. And I have to ask, because you said something a moment ago that made me curious. You said that you didn't want to write the book and
I
you
didn't.
resisted for so
I
long.
really didn't want
Tell
to
me
write
why. Tell me why you didn't want to do
It's
it.
freaking amount of work. It's a lot of work.
It is a
I
lot of
like
work.
to play.
Yes.
I like to go to the beach, and I like to look at whales, and that's what I would rather spend my life doing.
Yeah.
But I read Shane O'Sullivan's book with great anticipation, because I thought, if he tells enough of the truth, I'm off the hook.
Right.
And he didn't. Like I said, no one has
Yeah.
written about Sirhan and the blanks and the switching of the bullets. And I think that's absolutely critical to understanding this case. And honestly, if anybody else had written about that, I would not have written this book. I didn't want the fame, the glory, I just wanted to get the truth out.
You were
And
just hoping
and
somebody
I
else
looked
would do
around,
all
it's
that
like,
work for
who
you.
else is doing it? I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to freaking do this. And
I know
so you
that
need
feeling.
what they
I can
call
relate.
butt glue, to stick yourself in the season tight for hours at a time, and hours and hours and hours, and lunch hours and mornings and weekends. And I had no life, and now my apartment I'm still digging out, because I was working full time and writing the book full time. Something
Wow.
had to give, and it was the rest of my life. So it's like, it was a heavy price I paid. So please honor that sacrifice by at least reading it all the way through. Don't skim it. It's packed. Every page has data on it for a reason. There's no filler.
There's none. And it took me 6 months just to finish your book.
I believe it.
I took it nice and slow. I would really digest a few pages at a time, and then I would go double check your work, with my own
Good.
sources. And that's what you would want me to do. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I
And I
don't
think,
want anybody believing me just because it got published. It's like, that's why footnote on the page. I hate having to flip to the end and try and match up the notes while I'm reading.
thank you for
So I'm like,
doing that. I
I'm putting
appreciate
the
that.
footnotes
I hate
right
that.
there so they can stop right then and check it out. Yeah. Did you
And
see
they can
the
get your
video?
book on Amazon, any other place?
That you can literally order it through any bookstore. So if you have a favorite local bookstore that you want to support, just go in and say, I want to order this book, and they will buy it for you. And then they'll get their little cut, and it won't come from Amazon or go to Jeff Bezos. So,
Excellent.
Amazon is certainly easy. You're welcome to buy it there, but Barnes and Noble, they had it on the shelves when it first came out. And any little bookstore would be more than happy to order it for you. And I signed some in a store in Pasadena. Oh gosh, what is the name of it? Vroman's, VROMAN apostrophe S. And they might still have a few that are signed. If you want a signed copy, look up Vroman's online. I gave a speech there, and some very interesting people came to hear me and asked good questions afterwards. That was really fun.
Well, folks, I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Lisa. And if you're curious to learn more or hear more, I would recommend going to the C-SPAN archives. You can find free videos of some lectures that Lisa has done about the case, where she really lays out the evidence in detail, point by point. And also, I know some folks might look at the price tag on that book and go, "Whoo, $42. That's a lot." But
I was going to say, it isn't 42. I don't know why it's saying that now. It's
That would be
normally
because it's the
29.
Canadian price.
Yeah, it's only like
I've got
29 and
CA up. Yeah.
yeah. And again,
what is it, about
you can go to the
25,
library.
$27 US new?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you can
New
always
and then
pick up a used
Yeah,
copy or a library copy.
exactly.
But
And
even if you
like I
buy
said,
it,
I'm not in it for the money. Get it any way you can. Just please get it and read it. It's
Yeah,
a
well, the
huge
Kindle
part of the
version
history.
is, I think, $10.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
worth
15
every
in
penny.
Canada. $15 in Canada.
I bought the Kindle version myself just because it's easy to search that way and easy to
Right.
carry around on my phone, So, yeah.
It's a book that'll really make you think, and it'll make you question if everything you thought you knew about the Robert Kennedy assassination was wrong. And she gives you much to think about. I don't necessarily agree with all of her theories. I'm still up in the air on the blanks theory. I'm not sure about it, but
Go back and read the evidence.
you are
And
persuading
I don't mean
me.
in my book. I mean, go look at the files. Yeah.
You're starting to
Yeah.
bring me over to your side on that. So maybe like
I know I would
like
have gotten
Paul Schrade,
Paul
perhaps I can
eventually.
be
I'm so
convinced.
sorry. Yeah.
And God
That's
rest our good friend Paul Schrade. It was great of Bobby to speak at his memorial service back.
I was there. I heard Bobby's speech and I
Oh,
gave him a huge thumbs up afterwards because he did a great job. Yeah.
I wanted to be there too. So.
Yeah. Food was great too. We shared some ice cream.
Well, you are a lovely lady, Lisa, and it's been my
Oh, thank
pleasure
you.
to know you and to finally get you on the show. We've been trying to get you for months.
Yes.
So, I
And
think
it's
we picked
been a
the
real
right day.
pleasure to meet you. And
Yeah,
I am
both
so
of you.
excited. We're doing the Howard Hughes show.
Oh, how
Yes,
funny.
let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's
That would
do
be
it.
fun
How do we
because
do that?
I've never really talked about that, but I have done a lot of reading. There's some really weird stories there.
Really weird.
Connect
He's
with
a
other
really
weird
weird
stories.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole nother 2-hour show, and it'd be fascinating. We need to do that. Seriously. Great idea, Rick.
Yeah. We'll dig into that. Lisa, thank you so much for
Thank you
today's
both.
interview.
I appreciate that you're doing what you're doing because so few are these days telling the truth about things that matter. So
True
thank you.
spiracies.
True
True
spirits.
spiracies.
Has a ring to it.
Yeah, there was a TV show whose log line was "Not every conspiracy is a theory," and I thought we need to repeat that more and separate those words more for people.
That is
Yes.
so true. Most
Yes.
conspiracies are actual conspiracies. And let's not forget, the whole term conspiracy theory was invented by the
The
CIA.
CIA.
In between the
discredit?
two assassinations. It was like 1967.
67. They were trying to go after the critics of the Warren Commission as
Mm-hmm.
Garrison is ramping up to prosecute people with direct connections to the CIA, as Clay Shaw had.
And they
So-
called him a conspiracy theorist. They said
Mhm.
that about
and they
Mark
even gave the
Lane.
talking points that people still use today. They're in it for the money.
Yep.
They're in love with their story. You know, they just fall for anything. And that many people couldn't keep a secret. Hello, Manhattan Project. You know, it's like, yes, that many people can keep a secret if your livelihood depends on it. You know, what do you think the CIA hires people who can't keep secrets? What kind of an intelligence group would that be? Useless.
And your life depends on it because, as
good.
we know, there's a long
Exactly.
list of dead witnesses in the JFK case who
Yes.
did know something and talked to somebody and wound
Suddenly
up dead.
died. Yes, yes.
So,
Yeah.
what a fantastic
Mhm.
interview. Thanks for making it happen
Thank
today.
you. Thanks
Yeah.
for being so knowledgeable. It's always more fun to be interviewed by people who know what they're talking about. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming in, Lisa. We'll see you soon.
Lisa.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, ciao for now. And you know, I've got something queued up here.
Do you? What you got there?
I know she was a Howard Dean supporter, but I just can't resist.
Oh, you're not gonna do
I
it. There it
am
is.
Some of you may remember this. I do.
Well, you guys, you have already got the picture here. I was about to say, you know, I'm sure there's some disappointed people here. You know what? You know something? You know something? If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third in Iowa, we would have given anything for that. And you know something? You know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
Oh, God.
Oh my.
Gets me every time. Never gets old, does it? Ah! And that was the end of his career.
It was.
Just
And
boom,
And
over.
he didn't really do anything wrong.
No, he was just
He was just-
excited.
He just that, but that was it. Like, that's why politics is such a strange game. You just never know
And you know, Rick, it's so much of it was, I think, the media overblowing something. You know, candidates frequently get excited at a victory rally after they've won, and they might get too excited, but the media picked up on that and ran it over and over and over and really tried to tell you that this guy's nuts. You can't trust him. He's too crazy to be president. And I don't think Howard Dean was crazy at all. I think that was just a moment where he was excited and they made a media spectacle out of it and kind of changed the meaning of what was actually happening there. And it just goes to show you the level of deception that the media engages in, you know?
Yeah, but the one thing that I would never do is make a spectacle out of something like this.
Oh, never. Oh, damn, that's gotta hurt.
See, I might run it a bunch of times to draw attention to a serious problem, but I would never make a spectacle out of something like this. And I would never laugh at someone falling down like this. I would never do that. Ever. Nope, not me. No, I would only run it an appropriate number of times to make sure that people have the right context, the right amount of emphasis on incidents such as this. And because it's obviously someone else's fault because he turns and points to something on the ground on the stage. He's like, wasn't my fault. I want that person arrested immediately.
Have that removed.
Right there. See? Right there. Somebody, what was that over? Did you see that? Too many times.
I got a better one. Have you seen this one? There's a really funny version. Bring up my screen here, Rick.
There you go.
I don't know if you've seen this one. Are you ready?
Yeah,
here it goes. Ooh, that's gonna hurt.
Of course, somebody made that. Of course they did.
I love the sound effect.
Oh my.
Oh my goodness.
You see, we would never. I'm not laughing at Joe there at all. Not laughing at him. I'm laughing with Donald Trump.
That's it. The sound effect of the golf ball clocking him on the noggin is just so funny. Whoever did that, kudos.
Brilliant.
That's a great one. But no, we would never do a thing like that. We would
not
never,
on this channel.
We wouldn't want to,
We're way too classy for that.
Class act here.
Now the home of FU Friday. Oh my God.